Okay, we are live. Right, thank you. Welcome to the virtual hearing for the inquiry into the budget estimates 2021 through 2022. Before I commence, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people are the traditional custodians of the land which the Parliament sits. I'd also like to pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging from the Eora Nation and extend that respect to other Aboriginals viewing this broadcast. Today the committee will examine the proposed expenditure for the portfolio of police. Today's hearing is being conducted as a fully virtual hearing, which enables the work of the committee to continue during the COVID-19 pandemic without compromising the health and safety of members, witnesses and staff. As we break new ground with the technology, I would ask for everyone's patience through any technical difficulties that we may encounter today. Excuse me. Participants lose their internet connection and are disconnected from the virtual hearing. They are asked to rejoin the hearing by using the same link as provided by the committee secretariat. Before we commence, I would like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. There may be some questions that a witness could only answer if they had more time or with certain documents to hand. In the circumstances, witnesses are advised that they can take a question on notice and provide an answer within 21 days. All cases in budget estimates have a right to procedural fairness according to the procedural fairness resolution adopted by the House in 2018. Today's hearings are being broadcast live from Parliament's YouTube channel, and a transcript will be placed on the committee's website once it becomes available. Finally, a few notes on virtual hearing etiquette to minimise disruptions and assist our Hansard reporters. Can I ask committee members to clearly identify who questions are directed to? And could I ask everyone to please state their name when they begin speaking? Could everyone please mute their microphones when they are not speaking? Please remember to turn your microphones back on when you're getting ready to speak. If you start speaking whilst muted, please start your question or answer again so it can be recorded for the transcript. Members and witnesses should avoid speaking over each other so we can all be heard clearly. Also, to assist Hansard, may I remind members and witnesses to speak directly into the microphone. Avoid making comments when your head is turned away from it. All witnesses will be sworn prior to giving the evidence. First, starting with Mr. Coates-Trotter, could you please state your full name and position title and swear either an oath or an affirmation from the cards that have been emailed to you by the Secretariat?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. It's Michael Coates-Trotter. I'm the Secretary of the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice, and I am struggling to find the email from the committee secretariat, so my apologies. Perhaps you could come back to me, Mr. Chair. I'll just find that and then be available.
Commissioner Fuller, could you please state your full name and position title and swear either an oath or an affirmation?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Michael Fuller of the New South Wales Police Force. I will take the oath. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you. Commissioner Barnes, could you please state your full name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation?
My name is Michael Allen Barnes. I'm the Commissioner of the New South Wales Crime Commission. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Mr. Coates-Trotter?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I have.
You should know this off by heart.
I should. Slow learner. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thanks very much. We might start with Labor. Mr. Secord.
Thank you. For the benefit of Hansard, I'm Walt Secord, Shadow Minister for Police, Shadow Minister for Counterterrorism. Thank you, Mr. Coates-Trotter, Commissioner Barnes, Police Commissioner Fuller for attending. Firstly, Commissioner Fuller, I wish to thank you and the more than 17,000 police officers who are protecting the state and assisting with COVID. I'm on the public record many times backing the police officers who put the community first ahead of their own personal health and often safety. And I've spoken in support of frontline police officers who had to confront the illegal protests. Your officers have been thoroughly professional in very difficult circumstances, and I would like you to convey to officers that if any questions that are asked today are not a criticism of the hard work of individual police officers. So thank you again for everything you do in these difficult times. Now,
Thank you.
thank you. Now, it will come as no surprise that I would actually like to begin with COVID. On August the 26th, the Daily Telegraph crime reporter Mark Morey reported that at least 4 New South Wales police officers from different stations have tested positive to COVID, forcing a number of other officers into isolation. And he reported that those officers were in the eastern suburbs and in Dubbo in the Central West. Can you give us an update on the how many police officers are off duty or affected with COVID at this stage?
Good morning, Mr. Secord, and it's nice to meet you. And thank you for the acknowledgement of the work of the New South Wales Police Force officers, and I'll certainly pass that on. As you know, the COVID operation has been running since March last year, and New South Wales Police has been well engaged in a number of different aspects of the operation, not just from a law enforcement perspective, but also in terms of the assistance we have given health. Unfortunately, in August this year, we did have some officers who tested positive to COVID as a result of workplace interactions. And I think really the police force needs to be recognised that we went to nearly 20 months without an officer getting a positive hit from COVID, given the fact that in the hotel quarantine system alone, we've come into contact with around 250,000 returning Australians. So in relation to those officers, Mr. Secord, and I say one was a custody officer, and they had come in contact with a prisoner who was COVID positive. The other officers were officers who we believe have contracted it just in the course of operational duties. Thankfully, all of the officers are in okay health. But as a result of that, of course, the close contact, particularly at Dubbo and eastern suburbs, we did have a number of officers that were quarantining as a result of the close contact.
Do you have a number of officers who have contracted COVID?
In terms of at the moment in operational deployment, it's still my understanding that these are the only officers that have tested positive to COVID as a result of operational deployments. We have had other officers contact COVID through a family or non-workplace incident, sir, but I can certainly take on notice to get you a thorough update of those officers. Can I say that over 12,000 police have received 2 jabs at the moment, and in terms of the vaccination of the force, that is progressing well.
You actually raised vaccinations of police officers. On July 31st, Deputy Commissioner Mal Lanyon told ABC Radio that over 50% of the New South Wales police force were double vaxxed. So what is the current vaccination rate of the New South Wales police force? I understand there are about 17,500 officers.
17,700, sir. Can I say at last count, over 12,000 officers had received 2 jabs. But if we could perhaps take on notice to bring back how many officers have received a jab and 2 jab, if I could take that on notice. But I know as of the latest update, we had over 12,000 officers who had received 2 jabs.
Oh, thank you. Now, this morning there was, and yesterday there was an indication that corrective services were looking at the possibility of releasing, if necessary, if there was a prison outbreak of COVID. That has the New South Wales Police provided any advice to to corrections and to the government on what would happen if this occurred?
We are working closely with corrective services and the Secretary around potential backlogs of prisoners going into remand. That is something that we faced April, May last year as well. So we are in daily contact with corrective services around a potential backlog of remand prisoners that may well see prisoners have a longer stay in police cells, that's something we're having a daily discussion with. But in terms of any type of early release, I haven't been engaged on any strategy around that.
Thank you, Mr. Fuller. Mr. Coates-Trotter, as the most senior government bureaucrat, can you tell me what is the status of this plan to release around 1,000 prisoners if necessary? And what are the protocols? What are the standards? And when would it occur?
Thanks, Mr. Secord. I should stress this is not a first resort. This is a last resort, as was recognised by the Parliament when it last year endorsed changes to the Crimes Administration of Sentences Act, which provides in limited circumstances for the Commissioner of Corrective Services to consider, in extreme circumstances, the release on parole of inmates whose health is at higher risk because of COVID, who are in the last 12 months of their non-parole period and who have not committed a range of serious or violent offences. Now, in making those judgments, should it come to that, and I stress this is a last resort, not a first resort, the Commissioner will have assessed that someone is suitable for release considering community safety, the impact on registered victims, the suitability of accommodation, or anything else. Plus, the Commissioner can apply conditions without limit, which may include home detention or electronic monitoring. So the work has been going on, as Acting Commissioner Corcoran indicated yesterday, to identify prisoners who may fit those narrow categories. His estimate, as I understand it yesterday, was that maybe 200 or 300 people in that category. It's sensible that the work take place to identify those people, but no decision has yet been made, and we are a long way from any, in my view, the need to make any decision about early releases on parole.
Well, when you say release on parole, so that would be the usual conditions that someone would have on parole, such as electronic monitoring, reporting to police, things like that. Is that what you mean?
Yes, so it is release on parole, and parole comes with conditions, and the conditions that the Commissioner in that circumstance could apply are, as I say, without limit, which includes home detention, electronic monitoring, reporting to police, and any other conditions that were deemed appropriate.
So you're saying that this would be a last resort, so there would have to be major outbreaks of COVID in the prison system.
That's right, and but it's a possible scenario. It's not a likely scenario, but it is a possible scenario, as the Parliament recognised in endorsing the legislative power to do this in an extreme circumstance.
Thank you, Mr. Coates-Trotter. Now, Commissioner Fuller, I'd like to take you to the public health orders. Now, you'd be aware that the public health orders, that there have been 48 changes in 68 days to the various public health orders, and that works out to an average of a change every 1.4 days. How are officers responding on the front line to the changes in these in the public health orders, and how is it communicated to them, and how are they enforcing them?
Thanks, Mr. Secord. Obviously, over the evolution of the health order since February last year, I suspect there's been a lot more changes than that. We have our General Counsel work with General Counsel of DPC to construct what we would determine a fact sheet, so officers have an understanding of either the new health order or the evolution of the health orders. To assist with police, we have legal reps in our police operations center 24/7 in case officers are unsure. We have a process whereby at each area command, a supervisor will verify the infringement notice, and then that is then double checked at the police operations center to ensure that it is fit against the health orders at the time the ticket was written. And of course, the justice system still still evolves around that if someone would elect to take that matter to court. So we put an enormous amount of support around police, acknowledging, Mr. Secord, that the evolution of the health orders is a challenge for police, and obviously enforcing the laws to try and get community compliance in a pandemic has certainly been a challenge for the force.
Now, I don't know if you'd be aware, but on August the 6th, I lodged a question on notice in relation to the public health orders, and I asked a specific question about maintaining physical distance or social distancing of 1.5 meters. And the government reported back, and I'm quoting directly, while the New South Wales government continues to advise individuals to maintain physical distancing of 1.5 meters from others, this is health advice and not a provision of any public health order. So how does that play out when police officers are dealing with people on Bondi Beach or in the community, when in fact the requirement of social distancing of 1.5 meters is actually not the subject of a public health order?
Yeah, and I think throughout the pandemic, good health advice and the health orders have conflicted the community at times, and I understand that. I guess the guiding principle is that if you think about the moment, the 1 person per 4 square metre rule is the primary piece of legislation that we use to enforce not the 1.5 metre distance that you should be apart. That's a relatively safe distance. And I understand from the public's perspective, they will scratch their head, but washing hands is not a health order. It's just good health advice. Being 1.5 meters from someone is just good health advice. But if you think about Bondi Beach, then you can only have as many people there that 1.4 square meters would allow. And we work with local government in terms of parks and beaches, trying to determine that to best, enforce that 1.4 square metre rule. And at times it's been 1 person per 2 square metre rule, obviously in better times when licensed premises, etc., were open.
Now, Commissioner, in the area of the infringement notices, how many have been issued as of this week in New South Wales?
Yes, I can say that between March last year and April this year, we issued around 2,900 tickets, Mr. Secord, and obviously with the Delta variants, there was an escalation in police activity, given the nature of the virus. And as of this week, we have issued, and I will take it on notice, but we've issued in the last probably 6 weeks around 18,000 infringement notices. But again, if I could take that on notice, but it's been a significant escalation since the Delta variants has played out across New South Wales.
Now, you would be aware that in the United Kingdom in April, a quarter of all infringement notices were dropped or appealed by the community. What is the sticking rate, so to speak, of the infringement notices in New South Wales, and what occurs and what are the processes to challenge or dispute infringement notice?
Thanks, Mr. Secord. As I said, the justice system still exists, and like with any infringement notice, you can write to have that ticket reviewed, and or you can elect to take that matter to court. In New South Wales, the police force isn't a beneficiary of any funds derived from policing activities. So I would have to take on notice and chase, I guess, from one of the other agencies around what is actually happening post-police in that part of the justice system, if that's okay.
Okay. Now, I want to take you to the attack on the St. Mary's COVID testing center on the weekend, and the police officer who was commenting on it said, and I quote, "It's like the perpetrators would, quote, likely to do it again." Now, experts in the field that monitor far-right groups and that have advised me that these are academics and people who follow these groups, that in fact, this was not just simply a random attack. What's the status of the investigation, and what is your view that it in fact is beyond just a local resident doing that, it is actually an organized attack?
Well, thanks, Mr. Scott. I think the pandemic has brought out the best in the New South Wales community, and I think probably we've seen some of the worst as well. And we have certainly seen a rise in negative and I suppose right-wing sentiment, particularly online, and threats to public figures. It has certainly increased. In terms of that attack, malicious damage through arson and graffiti, we would believe it is clearly a targeted attack, and it is being investigated, and I will take on notice the status of the investigation, but it is an open investigation, crime scene attended. Obviously, we've taken that very seriously, particularly given the important role that the vaccination centres are playing in protecting the people of New South Wales.
Can I take you back to the earlier I think it was last year, ASIO head Mike Burgess said that 50% of their activity now was monitoring far-right groups. Has the New South Wales Police discovered, has there been a ramped up or increased of far right-wing activity in New South Wales under COVID?
I think over the last 5 years, it's fair to say there has been a progressive increase in right-wing extremism. Other states around Australia have probably seen a more significant increase. It probably consumes around 20% of the time of our counter-terrorism team more broadly versus other types of extremism. But nevertheless, it has certainly increased during COVID. And again, I think the online vitriol, the number of protests we've seen around Australia, I know this is a New South Wales question, but certainly some of the violence that we have seen during protests is unusual for Sydney.
Thank you. Mr. Coates-Trotter, what is the vaccination rate in your department?
So I can't give you a figure for the department as a whole. I suspect you might be interested in knowing what the vaccination rates are for correctional staff.
Yes.
So, and I should preface this by saying that we've had, working with Justice Health and other health providers, we've had vaccination clinics inside custodial facilities for both inmates and staff. And looking at that data, in other words, people who've been vaccinated by Justice Health, the latest Justice Health data shows nearly a bit over 41% are double dosed, 53.5% one dose. But we also ran a survey of correctional staff, and nearly 3,000 people responded to that survey, and that indicated among those survey respondents, about half of them had had vaccinations in the community. And the people who responded to that survey reported a double vaccination rate of about 50% and a single vaccination rate of about 80%. So we don't have, we can draw some inferences from that, but I can give you an estimate only.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Fuller, back to the 12,000. I think you said 12,000 out of 17,700 officers are vaccinated. Now, was that, for stand corrected, is that double vaxxed?
It's my understanding it is, Mr. Secord. We were given priority from health very early in the piece, and we still are, particularly in the LGAs, of concern. So I certainly expect to see that continue to grow. And I would expect that we would be near 100% vaccinated this year, given the role that we play coming in contact with COVID so regularly.
Now, a police officer that is unable. Oh, you're not the chair, Mr. Shoebridge.
Well, I'll go to the chair then.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay.
Yes, I'm going off that message app that we have, Walt, about the time.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Shoebridge.
Thank you. Thank all three of you for coming today. Mr. Coates-Trotter, you gave two figures about vaccination rates. One of, I believe that was of prison officers. Is that right?
Yes, it was. There were two perspectives on prison officers. The first was a rate of people who'd been vaccinated by Justice Health, and the second was a rate reported in a survey which included people who'd been undertaken a vaccination in the community.
And the highest of those two rates for double dose vaccination was 50%.
That's right.
Dose. What date is that?
That was as at mid last week.
Given there is so much anxiety, and for good reason, about COVID, the damage, the death and the illness that COVID will cause in New South Wales prisons, do you think it's acceptable that you've got vaccination rates amongst prison officers, double dose vaccination rates as low as 50%?
No, we want them to be higher, and I've communicated to staff of the organisation that we are undertaking a risk assessment process to consider precisely this issue. By the end of this week, we will have identified those workforces within youth justice that in our view need to be mandatorily vaccinated to come to work. And by Monday, the same for correctional staff. So we are taking an approach as an employer under work health safety legislation. So we've got to, if we make that direction, it has to be reasonable and lawful. And a key consideration there is the quality of the risk assessment that we've undertaken. So that's been underway, as I say, finished for youth justice and corrections within the next week, and for the whole of the agency by the end of September.
Mr. Coates-Trotter, why have you waited until there's been such substantial COVID outbreaks amongst the prison population to do that assessment? Why has it taken? Let me finish, Mr. Coates-Trotter. We can't talk over each other. So I'll start again. Mr. Coates-Trotter, why has it taken major COVID outbreaks in prisons for this risk analysis to be done and for you to start confronting the very real reality of requiring compulsory vaccination for prison officers?
I wouldn't accept the characterization. The outbreak you're referring to happened on Friday last week. This work's been underway for some while, and obviously we've been doing a whole range of things to try and manage the risk of transmission of COVID between staff and detainees and inmates, including rolling out rapid antigen screening for staff and fresh custodies. So we'll move as quickly as we can on it, but we want, if we give a direction, for it to not be able to be overturned on challenge. We want it to stick. We need it to be appropriately done so that it will stick.
What are the current numbers of COVID cases of COVID amongst inmates in New South Wales prisons?
Yeah, thank you. So there, the total number of people in prison obviously changes from day to day. It's around 12,940. Of those, as at late yesterday, 112 prisoners were COVID positive. And I should just point out a couple of things. This is only ever a point in time measure, and some of the public reporting by our colleagues in Justice Health relates only to those people who are supported by Justice Health as opposed to supported in Parkleigh. So 112 people COVID positive, 50 of them are in the Metropolitan Remand Centre, 1 is in Silverwater Women's, and 61 were in Parkleigh. So on Friday the 27th of August, 2 inmates in Parkleigh who were not in their quarantine pod tested positive for COVID. And we together with Parkleigh and their health provider St Vincent's responded very quickly. So by over the weekend, everybody in Parkleigh was tested, and everyone who had transferred from Parkleigh to other prisons in New South Wales has also been tested. We've got nearly all of the results of those tests for people who've moved from Parklea to other jails, and thankfully all of the tests we've currently got back are negative. We've also looked at people who've moved from Bathurst to other facilities, because as you would know, Mr. Shoebridge, there are nine prison officers who've tested positive for COVID at the Bathurst facility. We've tested everybody in Bathurst, around 500 people. As yet, no results have come back, no positive results, and no positive results among people who've moved from Bathurst to other facilities. And I should also add, everybody who had moved from Parklea or Bathurst to another facility is in isolation within the jails in which they are accommodated. So that's the update of the situation.
Mr. Coutts-Trotter, how on earth were two inmates who are COVID positive not in their isolation pods at Parklea? How on earth did that happen?
Well, the short story is we don't know. Justice Health, St Vincent's Health, the private operator, our teams have obviously been taking a very close look at how this happened. They don't know yet how the virus got from the quarantine pods in Parklea, 6A and 6B, to a non-quarantine pod, 6C. I don't have an answer to that question. It may emerge in time, but we don't have it yet.
What was the cause of the now 50 COVID cases at the Metropolitan Remand Centre at Silverwater? What was the cause of that?
Oh, they are people who come in with COVID from the community, Mr. Shoebridge. So all of the inmates at MRRC and Silverwater Women's contracted COVID prior to coming into custody. So they're identified as COVID positive when they come into custody and isolated.
Are you seeking to have alternate arrangements, reconsideration of bail for COVID positive inmates, particularly those who are non-violent offenders, to prevent as many as possible COVID positive inmates in the prison system?
Well, recognising the appropriate functions of people within the justice system, we've made sure that heads of jurisdiction or their officers, and particularly the acting chief magistrate, is aware of the situation, regularly updated on the situation within the custodial system. Similarly, I've spoken myself to legal aid, to the Aboriginal Legal Service, and to other DPP and others, so that people understand the situation. I understand from talking to legal aid and the Aboriginal Legal Service that they will bring forward fresh bail applications for a number of people who are currently held in custody. If you look at the situation now compared to the COVID outbreak last year, we are seeing similar rates of bail refusal. In other words, in 2020, we saw, following the pandemic outbreak, we saw a reduction in bail refusal rates, and we've seen a similar reduction in response to the Delta outbreak. What we haven't seen is a significant number of people on remand discharged on bail to the community, and clearly legal aid and the Aboriginal Legal Service are going to bring forward a number of those matters this week. I do know that the acting chief magistrate has indicated to his magistrates that any requests of that nature need to be dealt with as a matter of urgency.
Mr. Coutts-Trotter, why isn't there an administrative process in place using the powers that were granted to the Commissioner of Corrective Services to proactively bring forward the paroling of non-violent offenders? Why are you insisting upon not using those powers and what is now a very delayed and clogged court process?
Well, again, I wouldn't accept some of the characterisations in the question. It is clearly a measure that's available to the Commissioner of Corrective Services, but it's a last resort measure, not a first resort measure. And I would not characterise the situation inside prison, nearly 13,000 inmates, 112 with COVID within quarantine facilities, except for Parklea, and I don't understate the anxiety that families of people in Parklea are feeling. But I would not characterise the situation as anywhere near being out of control. It's under management, but preparatory work in case things get worse, as we've discussed earlier, is underway. And should it be necessary, then I'm sure the Commissioner will use those powers.
Are new inmates still being admitted into Parklea in circumstances where you don't yet know how the quarantine breach occurred?
No, they're not. So the Commissioner has reduced the number of facilities accepting fresh custodies, and in the metropolitan area, fresh custodies will be centralised to the Metropolitan Remand Centre and away from Parklea.
Has there been a prohibition on inmates being moved from Parklea until you understand the nature of the breaches?
Yes, there was a precautionary system-wide shutdown. There's 36 facilities. They were all locked down initially until we got better information. Parklea is locked down, together with, I think, 16 other facilities, and the balance, based on the results of testing, are now back to normal operation.
Mr. Coutts-Trotter, you would have read the report from the Inspector of Custodial Services about the many, many failings in the health oversight, and particularly the justice health response for prisons. Are you not concerned that given the multiple comorbidities, the very serious pre-existing health conditions that the prison population has, that this COVID outbreak could potentially see mortalities if you don't urgently reduce the overcrowding?
You describe overcrowding as a result of a $3.4 billion upgrade of the correctional system, prison building. There's now sufficient prison capacity. The protocol now for people coming in as fresh custodies is that they're to be quarantined alone in a cell, except where they're on health assessment, particularly mental health assessment. It makes sense to quarantine someone in company with one other person. Quarantine, of course, is where people are asymptomatic, they haven't tested positive, but on a precautionary basis as a fresh custody, we hold them in quarantine for at least 14 days, undertake 2 COVID PCR tests. People are isolated alone if they're symptomatic or they've got a COVID positive test. So at the moment, while the capacity is requiring close management, I wouldn't describe it as overcrowded. We're able to create safe environments in quarantine and isolation. And should that not be the case, of course, we'd move to other measures. It's really important, as you say, given the underlying health vulnerabilities of many people in prison, that we are really, really cautious about this, and we will be.
Commissioner Fuller, you'd be aware of the very, very real and serious COVID outbreak in Wilcannia in Western New South Wales?
Yes.
Have you spoken with your officers directly about the form of policing that's been undertaken, particularly the First Nations community in Wilcannia?
Sorry, can you put it in context that there's an emergency management operation being led by police in Wilcannia at the moment, focusing on people's health and vaccination? I'm just not sure when you use police operation, what term are you talking about?
I'm talking about the work of police, your police in the Wilcannia community. Have you spoken to your police about their work in the Wilcannia community during this COVID outbreak?
Yeah, they're leading the Australian Defence Force on the ground at the moment and the vaccination clinics, obviously ensuring that there's appropriate transport for food, medicine, that other agencies are represented in the community. So there's an enormous amount of work happening in that community to protect all the community from the virus, and particularly the spread of the virus.
How many fines have been handed out in Wilcannia since the most recent outbreak?
I've taken notice.
Have you had representations from the community in Wilcannia, concerned about individuals, First Nations members of the community, being fined, thousands, between $1,000 and $4,000 and $5,000 for undertaking daily activities such as shopping. Have these concerns been raised with you?
No, so I'm happy to take that on notice.
Commissioner Fuller, I've had multiple representations to me from members of the First Nations communities who are desperately in need of food, in quite desperate lockdown circumstances, having been fined for going fishing to seek food for their family, traditional fishing, seeking food for their family. Are police fining First Nations community members when they're going fishing, trying to get food in the lockdown?
I haven't heard any of those stories, but I'm happy for you to send them through to me personally. I'll review them.
Equally, Commissioner.
Of course.
Equally, Commissioner, I've had multiple representations about First Nations peoples, again, in circumstances where they have enormous difficulty obtaining fresh food, being fined by police when they are out engaging in traditional hunting for kangaroo to get some fresh food for their families. Have you had any of those reports given to you?
No, more than happy to receive those from you.
Do you accept that in those circumstances, with food, fresh food being at such a premium in Wilcannia, that it is inappropriate to fine First Nations peoples if they are, in a COVID-safe way, seeking to get food by way of fishing and or hunting?
I would have to see the tickets before I answer that question, but I look forward to receiving those complaints from you.
Equally, Commissioner, a number of community organisations have been told that they have been prevented by police from handing out fresh food supplies and food supplies to the community, although they've been in receipt of significant donations to the community to enable them to help the community. Is that a directive from New South Wales Police to prevent community organisations handing out donated food supplies in Wilcannia?
Police and Defence are working with NGOs and are delivering thousands of food packages across the state. So that certainly doesn't sound correct, but I'm happy to receive that as an additional complaint.
Are you saying that police and armed forces are handing out food? But I'm asking you about.
I said the Australian Defence Force, not armed forces.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't understand your distinction there, Commissioner. Can you explain it?
The Australian Defence Force are on the ground in a peacekeeping role. They are not armed. They do not come with any powers. They are vaccinating people. They are assisting with welfare packages. And I think the way you have framed it is incorrect.
Commissioner, I'm asking you whether or not your officers are preventing community groups from directly handing to the community in a COVID-safe manner donated food parcels. Have your police been preventing community groups from delivering food aid to the Wilcannia community?
Not to my knowledge, but obviously anything that is taken into a community of concern would need to be done in a way that doesn't endanger the community, and that those people dropping the food off would have the appropriate protective equipment not to take any more COVID into the community. So again, you would have to really send me the details of all these complaints so I could fairly assess them, because if someone turned up with a basket full of food, they had no masks, they had no hand cleansing, they had no idea about the dangers of COVID, then sending them into a community may be disastrous. So again, more than happy to receive any of these complaints to substantiate the truth.
But Commissioner Fuller, you would have no theoretical objection, I assume, to community groups with approved COVID safety plans handing out donated food and delivering donated food to the Wilcannia community, would you?
No, not as a general statement.
Commissioner, it was reported in the Sydney Morning Herald that you said, and indeed I think you made this report publicly, that you said in relation to COVID policing, I appreciate there's a lot to take in with the health orders, but I'm asking you, and this is a direction to your police, to put community policing to the side for a short period of time. I have said before, if you write a ticket and you get it wrong, I understand and I won't hold you to account for that. Do you recall giving that communication to New South Wales Police?
Absolutely.
What did you speak with New South Wales Health before you gave your direction to New South Wales Police to put community policing aside?
The reality is that the Delta variant was spreading across the state. We were seeing low levels of compliance by people in relation to the health orders. I was sought by the government to establish a police operation to improve compliance with the health orders. We were issuing days, we're issuing probably 4 times the amount of cautions as we were taking infringements. And from the Commissioner's perspective, I believe that we needed to take stronger action. And I told the officers I would support them in taking that action. We still are issuing cautions right across the state. But the reality is that the level of enforcement has increased. And that was certainly feedback, not just from the government, but from the community. They expected that people actually listened to and applied the health orders equally across the state.
Who in the government told you to not do community policing?
That's a decision of mine in terms of language. Now, in terms of the way that we had policed COVID from March to April last year to this year, we'd issued, I think, 2,900 tickets. COVID was well in control, and I mean, health and police were well in control. The state was safe.
My question was quite specific.
Sorry,
Commissioner,
can I finish my answer?
But it's not responsive, Commissioner Fuller. Who in the government gave you the direction that you relied upon to direct your police?
I've already answered that.
Community policing.
You're not listening. I said it was a decision by the Commissioner.
Sorry, there was a decision by you.
I've said that at the commencement of the answer that you interrupted me on.
Unfortunately, my time's expired, but I'm sure we'll come back to this, Commissioner.
Well, can't wait.
Thank you. Commissioner, I'd like to return to some of the questions earlier about the 12,000 police officers out of the 17,700. So that works out to around 2/3 vaccinated. So what steps is the government taking to increase vaccination rates amongst the police officers?
Mr. Secord, I apologise if it's just me, but you're underwater. I apologise if you could just ask the question again. I'm sorry.
Bear with me for 1 second, please. Test, is that okay?
A little bit, yes.
Sorry about that. Commissioner, earlier in the hearing, you mentioned that 12,000 of the 17,700 police officers were vaccinated. That's about 2/3. So what steps are you taking to increase vaccination rates amongst police officers?
Well, that's the good news. The answer to that question is even just in the last half an hour, I've got the actual updated figures, Mr. Secord. So we have 15,433 officers have received 1 dose, and 13,336 officers have received their 2nd dose. So nearly 70% of the workforce 1 dose. So health have been extremely supportive of New South Wales Police being vaccinated. We have our own vaccination hub set up in locations in Sydney. We are, days coming up, we will get special days again for police officers to be vaccinated. And we will work towards 100% of the workforce to be vaccinated in the coming months, unless, of course, you have a medical reason why you can't. But 70% of the workforce to date has had 1 dose, and I think we're really progressing well.
Commissioner, so the officers that were required to be involved in the protest, the 69 protests yesterday, and the protests that occur in July, were special provisions or special consideration given to those who hadn't had their 2nd vaccinations? What occurred involving those protests?
So in terms of hotel quarantine, officers who are working in the hotel quarantine system must be vaccinated. In terms of frontline policing, we haven't mandated yet that you have to have had a single or a 2nd dose. But work health and safety, we're working this week to come up with a policy decision around the vaccination of the organisation. So look, from my perspective as the Commissioner, I want every officer and every civilian employee vaccinated just because of the inherent risk of policing and the nature that we do our business. So I would hope by the end of the year that we are at maximum vaccination.
Okay. Now, on the concept of vaccine passports, have you provided advice to the government on, I guess, policing, regulating, enforcing vaccination passports?
Certainly from the police perspective, we are supportive of a system, whether that's through Services New South Wales or otherwise, where there's one source of truth in terms of not just enforcement, but from an employment perspective. So we are supportive of a vaccination passport. Now, what that looks like, I guess we have left that to the experts, Mr. Walt.
Thank you, Mr. Fuller. Mr. Coutts-Trotter, do you have anything to add in the area of vaccination passports?
No.
No. Okay. Commissioner Fuller, now, on July the 1st, you announced that you intended to retire next April. And I want to thank you for your service and steering the community and the officers. But you put a little bit of a caveat on that. You said depending on COVID and what's the response. Are you still intending to retire in April, or is there a COVID question mark over that?
Look, the vaccination rate is really the key, Mr. Secord, for mine, and that 80% number. And I think if that's achieved in New South Wales and the rates of vaccination are going extremely well, I think I can safely hand over to an incoming commissioner. I think we have to live with COVID. And for mine, the concept that I would need to stay until COVID, there was a resolution, I think I'd be around well past my use date. So look, at this stage, it certainly is my intention to retire, but not this year, certainly next year. There's an enormous amount of work to be done this year, so I'm certainly not walking away from the job this year. But the reality is the vaccination rates is key to, I guess, our passport to back to freedom. And perhaps, you know, the issues of the way that this has been policed, it will be a good time for a new commissioner to come in with a fresh set of eyes and lead the force back towards community policing and away from COVID-19. So, you know, I think in many ways it will probably be a good time to pass the baton over.
Now, Commissioner, when the hard lockdowns occurred in Western Sydney and Southwest Sydney, that there were concerns about policing of those areas and concerns expressed by community leaders. Can you give us a bit of an update in that area?
Yeah, thanks. We have done an enormous amount of work with those communities. We actually have very good relationships with the communities and the leaders. We engaged that through emergency management arrangements. I think what was particularly important was the use of our multilingual services, the way that we communicated across those communities about vaccination rates, about staying safe. It reached the point probably 4 or 5 weeks ago where the feedback was that they were at saturation point around communication and you know, they had gotten the message clear in terms of what was needed. The Delta variants obviously has been such a great challenge for police and for health, but nevertheless, we are treating the virus itself like it's a criminal. Therefore, wherever the virus is, you will see an increased police presence. Whilst there are some in the community who are concerned about that, Mr. Secord, there are plenty of people who are unhappy with low levels of compliance. And I think the numbers of calls to Crime Stoppers and to local police is indicative that there are plenty of people out there doing the right thing, and they're not happy with the current restrictions as a result of people not applying the health orders appropriately. But we'll continue to work with local groups. We'll continue to work with local community leaders. but I'm certainly not denying that it's not a challenge at times.
Commissioner, there was also concern expressed about the deployment of military, of Army. How is that working, and how is the New South Wales Police Force interfacing with the Army in those areas?
Thanks, Mr. Secord. Look, Defence have been on the ground since the bushfires back in 2019, believe it or not, and they have been on the ground assisting New South Wales Police, New South Wales Health, Rural Fire, and most importantly, local communities. They are well trained. They understand planning and logistics extremely well. At the moment, we have nearly 1,000 members of the Australian Defence Force on the ground across New South Wales. Again, there are 4 key vaccination hubs that have been set up in Western New South Wales. We have officers in and around Western and Southwestern Sydney assisting police with welfare checks, dropping off food, and a whole range of other activities. They're also assisting police with the hotel quarantine operation, and they have been such an invaluable resource for the people of New South Wales, and they are well received on the ground. And there have been more than a handful of occasions where we've done welfare visits on COVID positive people, where we've had to call 000, summons an ambulance, and we've saved lives. So I think, you know, the value that they have added on the ground versus this potential issue around the perception, I think the value outweighs the perception of a few, perhaps in relation to defence.
Now, I want to take you to the high profile, what's been dubbed the Maroubra Party. So what were the stumbling blocks, or why did it take? I think you've set up a strike force or a task force or a special unit to look into this. What was the delay, or why did it take a while to do that?
One of the challenges, and I have to unfortunately even accept this as a reasonable challenge, is that the contact tracers have such an important work to do, which is putting aside the clinical aspect of protecting the people's lives who may have been at the party who have COVID, but it's about working out the close contacts. And if you don't get that part right, you don't stop the spread of the virus. So I understand there are times when there is a delay in telling police what happened, because there is a delay in finding out the truth around the close contacts. Now, I guess a line has to be drawn in the sand at some stage, but I think it is reasonable that we give health and the contact tracers a reasonable amount of time to work out the close contacts, because if you can't work out the close contacts, then you don't stop that community transmission. And I think with the Delta variants, that has been a great challenge for us. Nevertheless, Mr. Secord, we are pretty bullish, and we don't forget, and we'll ring every day and ask for the names, and eventually we will get them, and eventually we will take necessary action.
Now, are there protocols in place involving the contact tracing and New South Wales Police?
We don't work with the contact tracers. They play an important role. The Australian Defence Force is certainly assisting with that. But the law enforcement side of those community transmissions, where there's been a breach of the health orders, police is reliant on receiving that information from New South Wales Health.
So does New South Wales Health make a decision? Do they have discretion in the sense that if someone's violated a public health order, can they in fact waive prosecution of that health order in exchange for getting further information from a person?
Well, it's a fascinating question. I don't think they are prosecuting authority in relation to the health orders, but could I take that on notice? It's a good question. You've stumped me.
Okay. Now, immediately after the 69 protests yesterday across the state, the organizers indicated that they were regrouping for another protest on September the 18th. How much police resourcing and activity is actually going into responding to these groups?
Yeah, it's too much. In short, Mr. Secord, I mean, if you go pre-COVID, we had around 1,000 protests a year in New South Wales. They were generally peaceful. You had very few arrests made. The relationship between protest organisers and police is generally a positive one. But obviously the COVID protests are very different. Last year, we had organisers come forward. We were able to challenge these matters in the appropriate judicial system. Obviously, 2021 is a very different environment around protests. You don't tend to have protest organisers anymore, and you just have a group of people, a rabble, if you like, are turning up. But it's using up an enormous amount of police resources that could well be used assisting health at the moment. And I just think people underestimate the risks they take coming together in such big numbers. We've heard this morning that COVID, exists in our prisons, and it exists now in police custody. And this idea that you would put yourself close to that and your family's close to that, it just makes no sense at all at the moment. There are so many other ways that people can protest at the moment without actually having to turn up and particularly be violent.
Now, Commissioner, some of the experts that monitor these far-right groups and activity maintain that yesterday's protests had a different, I guess, were organized by different aspects or different. Do you believe that yesterday's protests differed from the larger ones in July?
Well, I think that's too early to say in terms of we need to assess the intelligence, but we are certainly doing that as part of any environmental scan. It's important for a couple of reasons, but I guess primarily is that we know that there will be, unfortunately, there'll be future protests. So it's important that we understand the threat to police and the community when these unauthorised protests occur.
Now, in these, do the organizers of these protests fall under the work of the Fixated Persons Unit?
No, the protests, it don't fall under that at all. I mean, each protest is assessed individually. Days like yesterday are unusual, particularly when it requires a statewide response. So when we had people at Tweed, Byron, Richmond, Coffs Harbour, Mid-North Coast, Port Stephens, Fairfield, Sutherland, Hurstville, Blue Mountains. So when you talk about those type of numbers, you will have multiple different interest groups who are turning up. So the great challenge is trying to work out the different groups and those that are potentially right-wing extremists and those who may have different beliefs. And often we see these days with protest groups that multiple interest groups will come together. And that's the only way that they can get the sort of numbers that we saw yesterday. So I guess the challenge is amongst all of that is pulling out the intelligence, particularly about those who are violent or dangerous to our community.
Now, Commissioner Fuller, you'd be aware of the protests on the Tweed-Coolangatta border in northern New South Wales. Have you given, or has the New South Wales Police given advice to the New South Wales government? There is a proposal to move the border checkpoint to the Tweed River and another proposal to the edge of the Tweed Shire. Have you provided any advice on whether you'd be able to enforce a different border?
I've simply provided the advice from a transport perspective and a policing perspective that it would be unhelpful for New South Wales to move the border. So I wasn't supportive of it.
You weren't supportive of it. So what are the unique challenges that you have on the border? So is the problems occurring people trying to come back to New South Wales or trying to get into Queensland?
I think one of the challenges is that Queensland see themselves in a very different situation at the moment than New South Wales in terms of the virus. So their health orders are framed differently. Their they're open to the idea of protests at the moment because they don't see the Delta variants as a threat to their state. So I guess there are multiple challenges in just lining up the different sort of philosophies that our states have at the moment around public safety and the Delta variant. So that in itself would make you old, Mr. Secord. But then, of course, you've got different policing strategies, different police powers. Look, thankfully, the last couple of protests, we haven't actually had anyone from New South Wales turn up. The majority of the people were on the Queensland side of the border, and they didn't come into New South Wales. We did have one protest, I think it was around 3 Sundays ago, where we had a large number of people from Queensland and a small number of people from New South Wales who had engaged each other, which obviously was a health risk in itself. So, look, the border areas are a challenge for police generally, but certainly from a protest perspective, that's taken the challenge to the next level.
Now, Commissioner, a lot of commentary has been about COVID. So, but how is COVID playing out on other crime activity in New South Wales? Generally, is crime increasing, decreasing, stabilizing, or are we seeing spikes in certain areas?
Property crime is certainly some of the lowest that we've seen in modern history. It sort of has been fascinating to watch different factors such as federal government injections of money into the economy, the movement of people. But look, generally overall, crime is extremely low or extremely stable. We certainly are seeing in some areas such as adult sexual assault, child sexual assault, and domestic and family violence, that those numbers are unfortunately consistently high. But in most other areas, from the road toll, etc., we are seeing some sort of historic lows for modern history policing. Unless, I mean, so, the Secretary may have a different opinion on some of those.
Mr. Mr. Coates-Trotter?
I never disagree with the Police Commissioner on matters of fact. That's all true. I mean, I would stress that, underline the Commissioner's point that in relation to sexual offences and also domestic violence incidents, both criminal and incidents reported to police, while they're not rising, they are stable, and they are stable at very high levels.
Okay, thank you. Is that an indication my time has expired? Yes, okay, thank you.
Thank you. I will lead questions for the Greens and then hand over to my colleague, Mr. Shoebridge. And I believe that these questions are probably best directed to you, Commissioner Fuller. And it does actually come nicely off of the questions that my colleague, Mr. Secord, was just asking. I've been asking Minister Elliott now since the beginning of 2019 exactly why it is that New South Wales is the only jurisdiction in Australia not to be able to produce data on why sexual assault claims are being withdrawn or discontinued. I've been told that the police force's computerised operational policing system, otherwise known as COPS, has been, although it records the reasons for withdrawal and discontinuation of sexual assault claims, you can't capture that data. After asking several more questions, I've been told that actually COPS is now going to be replaced with a new system known as IPOS, and that the IPOS system will provide that functionality. However, it's not expected to be able to actually extract that data for another 4 years. So I want to know why this has not been more of a priority for the New South Wales Police Force. Commissioner Fuller, is sexual assault a priority for the New South Wales Police Force?
Yeah, look, absolutely it is. And thanks for the question. Could you tell me which police force does this well? I just would be interested so I can go and research it.
Yeah, so pretty much every other jurisdiction in New South Wales. I'm happy to provide you with that data.
I don't know, I'll do the homework. Can I just say this, is that sexual assault is a very different journey for a victim than many other types of crimes. And the reason for a matter discontinuing is not just as simple as I no longer want to proceed. So I think there will always be challenges in coming up with a data set that gives you a perfect snapshot of why victims discontinue with the journey. And I just find it a little hard to believe that any force has that sort of rich data, but I will certainly go away and test that.
Yes, I would encourage you to do that. And it's unfortunate that this issue hasn't come across your desk earlier.
Can I say, but not every victim comes to police, and not every victim that goes to another agency who makes a report of it seeking welfare or health support, they come to police. So I think this is a much more complex issue, to be honest with you, than just looking at police and how it interacts with the justice system. And I guess what I'm saying is I do care. I do want to make this journey better for victims. And I know there's a range of reasons why victims don't go ahead. And that is because quite often the chance of successful prosecution is extremely low. And the journey that a victim goes on in these cases is a traumatic one. And I suspect that police have these honest conversations with victims along the journey as well. Now, is that unhelpful? Well, potentially it is, but we know that the successful prosecution rates for sexual assault versus property crime, they're immeasurably different. And I think that the work that the Attorney General has done at the moment with the review in relation to this, obviously new legislation would need to be passed through both houses of Parliament. I won't see that, obviously, but I'll take on notice the iPods question, and as we build this system, the ability to get better data out around the victim's journey. I'll certainly take that on notice.
Thank you. And as you've identified, there are many reasons why someone might withdraw a complaint or why it might get discontinued by the police themselves. And that is why that data that we've obtained from the rest of Australia has been so useful in working out what we can do better. And so I would really encourage the New South Wales Police Force to get on board with capturing that data as well. I don't understand, to be frank, how it can be that every other jurisdiction is able to do this. And we are.
And again, I'm at a loss, but I will go away this week and I will ask the question. But the reality is, you would have legal advice that says the matter doesn't have a likelihood of success, and you have a victim saying, I don't want to proceed, right? They're the two key reasons why a matter would stop before it got into the courtroom. Now, there's a multiple reasons within those two cohorts, but either the victim doesn't want the matter to proceed, or we've been given legal advice to say that there's no likelihood of successful prosecution, right? They're the two key cohorts. Now, within those two cohorts, you're never going to get the thousands of different reasons why, but let me go away and look at those as the two primary reasons why a matter doesn't progress into our justice system, to see what I can find from our systems. And I'll also go to probably Save Victoria, which is a large organisation, to see how they're extracting their data.
Thank you. And with respect, you know, there was a proposal earlier this year for the consent app, and we're not going to cover that again, but the idea that we could fix something as complicated as consent with technology, and yet you have overseen a police force that has been unable to capture something as simple as data. This is actually a very pressing concern, and it's something that's been reported a lot in the media, so it does surprise me.
No, look, I agree, and I took a strong stance early this year around victims of sexual assault, and I must have missed your support at the time whilst people were putting the boot into me. But nevertheless, I'd certainly thank you for the question, and we'll take those seriously on notice, and I will check with the other jurisdictions.
Thank you. I'll hand over to my colleague.
Thanks very much, Ms. Boyd. Mr. Fuller, one of the most high-profile sexual assault investigations that the New South Wales Police were tasked with was the investigation that became known as Strike Force Windara, involving the allegations in relation to the former federal Attorney General. You're aware of Strikeforce Windara?
Yes, we have discussed it before at estimates, I believe.
The post-operational report from Strikeforce Windara has now been largely released and largely unredacted. It provides, and I quote, investigators from the Child Abuse and Sex Crime Squad never had the opportunity to commence the investigation into the historical sexual abuse of X due to her passing by suicide. Are you aware that that was the content of the post-operational assessment?
Oh, look, I haven't revisited any of that matter since it was closed off early this year. So, but are you asking me to accept what you're saying or take on notice? I'm not sure what you're asking.
I'm asking if you're aware.
You're hanging for me. I'm not sure if it's just me. I'm not the only lucky one.
Yeah, that was the outcome. Sorry, Mr. Fuller. I think I got like.
You broke up, David. You might
Can
want
you
to
hear
try
me
again.
now, Mr. Fuller? Can you hear me now, Mr. Fuller?
I can
you hear me
now.
now? Cool. I was asking if you
I
were
can
aware
now.
that that was the conclusion of the post-operational assessment, Mr. Fuller. And do I understand it? You weren't aware of
I haven't read that. No. What I'm saying is that that matter has been finalised. If you want me to go back and read the post-operational assessment, I'm happy to do that.
Well, Mr. Fuller, I'd ask you to explain, if you could, given that that was the conclusion of the post-operational assessment, that the investigation never commenced, how it is that the New South Wales Police, in their media statement on the 2nd of March 2021, said, and I quote, based on information provided to New South Wales Police, there is insufficient admissible evidence to proceed. As such, New South Wales Police Force has determined the matter is now closed. How could that statement have been issued when it is so obviously contradictory to the assessment of the own strike force?
Yeah, I'm happy to take both those matters on notice. I'll read them and I'll come back to you on notice.
Mr. Fuller, do you accept that given the concerns that were in the community and remain in the community about this matter, that there is an absolute obligation on New South Wales media for being accurate in this regard?
Oh, sorry, I didn't understand the question about the media.
Well, what I'm putting to you, Mr. Fuller, and I'll be very clear, is that the New South Wales Police media release of the 2nd of March 2021 was wrong and plainly wrong, and saying that there was, following an investigation, there was insufficient admissible evidence, when indeed the post-operational assessment makes it clear no investigation commenced. Are you concerned that New South Wales Police media gave out a misleading and inaccurate statement on the matter?
Well, I think you've asked me this question twice, and I've said to you I'll take on notice. I'll go back and review both the documents, and I'll come back and answer you on notice. I don't see you asking the same question again is going to get a different response from me. I understand the question. I understand you referred to 2 documents. I think I have the right to go back and review those before I answer the question. I think it's called procedural fairness. I think that was what we spoke about.
Perhaps.
Perhaps.
Mr. Fuller, can you confirm that on the very day that New South Wales Police closed the investigation, shut down the strike force, was the very same day that they received in their possession a signed, dated statement from the alleged victim, that occurred on the same day? On the same day police received a signed, dated statement, they also shut down the strike force?
I'll have to take that on notice.
When you do that, Mr. Fuller, can you explain, if that is the case, how on earth that those 2 things coincided? The receipt of
notice. Thank you.
Do you think that would be an unusual practice to shut down a strike force about an alleged sexual assault on the same day that police received a vast amount of additional fresh materials signed by the alleged victim? Is that usual practice for police?
Well, it would all depend, I suppose, on whether the police knew that information was forthcoming or it wasn't forthcoming. I think, again, in fairness, I have to look at all the circumstances around that before I answer that question.
And can you answer, when you do that, what, if any, merit assessment was undertaken within the less than 24 hours that the police had with that signed statement before they shut down the investigation?
Absolutely, I'll take that on notice as well.
Commissioner Fuller, I asked you earlier whether or not what I understand to be now your decision to put aside community policing was supported by any New South Wales health advice. And I didn't receive a clear answer, so I'm going to ask you again. Was your decision to put aside community policing during this COVID response consistent with New South Wales health advice you received?
I'm not sure how policing and health advice come together in relation to this. What I did is I gave an undertaking to assist health in two ways. One was assisting with contact tracing. The second one was treating the virus like a criminal, putting police in the areas of concern at the right time, the right place, and taking strong action to try and reduce the spread of the most challenging Delta variants. The evidence was that police were issuing tickets, issuing cautions 4-1. That wasn't having an impact in terms of shaping community behaviour in some areas, and the spread of the virus was obvious that was the case. So from my perspective, to increase community compliance on the back of all the complaints we were receiving in terms of COVID, I gave police the confidence to take strong action where necessary, and I stand by it.
So, Commissioner, when you came to the conclusion, and I'll quote from you earlier today, we're treating the virus itself like a criminal, so wherever the virus is in the community, we will be there. That's a decision you've made from a policing perspective, and it hasn't been informed or supported or endorsed by New South Wales Health. Is that right?
New South Wales Health are supportive of the police operation. They're supportive of the police assistance in terms of assisting with contact tracing. They're supportive of police being in the right time, in the right place to stop the spread of the virus. Now, in terms of how I do that, that's a matter for the Commissioner of Police.
So it's your position that you can basically arrest the virus, is that right? You can arrest this pandemic, and using your arrest powers and your fine powers, you can prevent the pandemic, you can police it out of the way. Is that?
Well, that sounds sort of like a nonsensical statement. But what I will say is that by using the current methods of the way that we profile crime, in that we look at time, date and place, the movement of the virus through our community, if we can somehow assist health in stopping the spread of that community into additional LGAs, then we actually protect those LGAs for stronger restrictions.
Do you have any statistical evidence that your more aggressive policing, particularly in Western and Southwestern Sydney, has led to a reduction in COVID transmission? Do you have any reliable statistical evidence to support that belief?
Look, I believe if it wasn't for the policing of the virus, the Delta variants, it would probably be at 10,000 cases. Is that I think that the health system would be entirely overwhelmed. I think if it wasn't for the way that we have policed this, that we would be in a disastrous situation in this state.
I hear your opinion. I'm asking if you have any evidence that the more aggressive policing has reduced COVID, particularly when you look at the differential in policing rates.
Yeah, certainly. If you look at
indeed, where you have more police, that doesn't seem to be working, does it, Commissioner?
Yeah, well, look at the United Kingdom. United Kingdom, a very similar policing environment. They took a very different attitude toward 130,000 people dead, Mr. Shoebridge. How about that statistic?
Is that
people dead?
Is that your evidence? That's your evidence. The United Kingdom, with their laissez-faire approach under Boris Johnson, is your comparator. That's what you've relied upon in your aggressive policing response, Commissioner. Is that seriously your evidence?
You asked for evidence. I've just given you some.
And that's the quality of the evidence you've relied upon for your zero tolerance aggressive policing, particularly in Western and Southwestern Sydney.
I never use zero tolerance, and I think it's wrong that you put words in my mouth. We still issue cautions to people every day for COVID-related fines. So I'd ask that you don't put words in my mouth. Have some respect.
Indeed, I think it's a two-way street, Commissioner Fuller. Could I ask you about the evidence you gave about the incident at Lockyer Street involving a deputy police commissioner who was found reported in by members of the public to be lying down unmoving on the footpath near midnight? Do you recall that?
The evidence I gave where, sorry?
To a former budget estimates hearing where you gave evidence about how Mr. Lanyon spoke to you about that event where he was found on the footpath close to midnight and reported in by members of the public. Do you recall that evidence?
I recall giving evidence in relation to Mr. Lanyon, yes.
And your evidence was that Mr. Lanyon had told you that he'd had a medical episode and had had low blood pressure, and that explained him lying down and being found by ambulance officers and police close to midnight on the footpath. Do you recall that evidence?
I don't have the transcript with me, but I recall that being certainly part of my evidence, yes.
Mr. Fuller, we've now had access to the full paramedic reports, and they show absolutely that Mr. Lanyon had a very healthy blood pressure. And they also show unambiguously that he was smashed, heavily intoxicated, and clearly there by reason of being intoxicated. Have you checked those paramedic records?
I think it's so concerning that someone's medical records can be obtained and then leaked, and you're worried about whether he was intoxicated or not, but you can access someone's medical records and leak them to the media, and that's okay. And we're talking about someone who may or may not have been intoxicated. I mean, I'm pretty blown away by this whole thing, to be honest with you. It's not an offence to be intoxicated, I hope, in public place, I hope.
Mr. Fuller, you know that the documents were released following a detailed and thorough process, including an arbitral process from a very senior retired judge in New South Wales. There was no leak, and you've been told it's a leak, in which case I'm not sure where you got that information from. You know it went through a detailed arbitral process, don't you?
Oh, sorry, you're talking to me?
Mr. Fuller,
sorry,
you know that the phrase leak is plainly false. You know that it was released following a detailed process in the New South Wales Parliament involving a senior retired judge. You know that, don't you?
My information was, and if I'm wrong, I'll stand corrected, that it was in the papers before it was anywhere else.
Well, you've been often wrong on this, Mr. Fuller, so I'm asking you whether or not you want to correct your prior evidence.
I'll take it on notice and go back and have a look at the time frame of it.
Commissioner Fuller, Mr. Deputy Commissioner Lanyon was intoxicated, smashed. He had healthy blood pressure, and he gave you a false version, according to your evidence, about what happened on the night. Are you just simply going to accept that your Deputy Commissioner gave you a plainly false version of events? Then you repeated that to the New South Wales Parliament under oath. You think that's fine?
I spoke to the CEO of Ambulance. I gave that evidence as well. We spoke in relation to, was there any issues that I needed to be concerned about in terms of unlawful conduct or conduct, obviously in breach of, policy, I suppose. There was a discussion around low blood pressure. I'm not a doctor, not a professional, but the CEO of Ambulance said his information was consistent with what could have been low blood pressure. So really, from that perspective, I think it's reasonable that I didn't just let this lie. I actually contacted the CEO of Ambulance, as I stated on the record at last budget estimates, Mr. Shoebridge.
Mr. Fuller, what you stated on the record at last budget estimates was plainly false and directly contradicted by all of the paramedic records, and also failed to mention that Deputy Commissioner Lanyon had to be restrained by police because he was shaping up and threatening the paramedics. Are you okay with that behaviour by Mr. Lanyon as disclosed in the paramedic records?
Look, I'm disappointed that Mr. Lanyon obviously brought the office into question. He's a decorated police officer. He's a very experienced police officer, and he should have known better. It's certainly not an offence to be intoxicated in a public place, although I would imagine that most people would be happy with that. And at the end of the day, I did counsel him for his behaviour, and that is on the record as well. But again, all I can do is go to the head of ambulance and ask the appropriate questions, and the responses I gave meant the matter was finished. Now, we also
Commissioner Fuller,
we also referred the matter to the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission. They've looked at this twice and have decided to leave it with New South Wales Police. So it's not as though that this matter hasn't been played out in the public. And so I'm not sure what you're looking for in this.
Commissioner, what I'm asking for is that senior police be held to the same accounts as constables or members of the ordinary public would. And if Mr. Lanyon's behaviour, his threatening behaviour towards paramedics doing their duty, had been undertaken by an ordinary member of the public or a constable, there would have been a police investigation and a potential prosecution for assault. Mr. Lanyon has had none of that. He's been waved through by you following his own false assertions to you, which you then repeated to budget estimates. I'm putting to you that that's a woefully inadequate form of accountability.
Yeah, I acknowledge your comments. And again, he's been counselled for his behaviour. I haven't received any complaints from anyone in ambulance, and I've spoken to the head of ambulance to make sure that my actions were appropriate. And look, LEC have been informed about this. I'm just not sure where the big cover-up in this exists, to be honest with you.
Will you review Mr. Lanyon's conduct in terms of him, A, providing what is clearly false evidence to you when you asked him about it, and B, a potential assault of paramedics who are simply trying to do their job and should not have been sworn at and face the conduct from Mr. Lanyon? Will you undertake those two reviews?
If I receive any additional information that allows me to open a fresh investigation, then of course I will.
Mr. Chair, are we out of time, or can I resume questions?
I know we've just gone over time. Sorry, yeah, it's 11 a.m.
I'm on overtime as we speak, Mr. Secord.
Thank you.
Time. Would you like some more overtime? No? Okay. All right. On that juncture, we'll call it a day. We're knocking off from 11, restart at 11:15. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, baby. Hey.
Good morning, this is the Secretariat here, just testing your sound for our witnesses. Please noting that we are currently live. So if our witnesses in the meeting room would just like to talk to just make sure that we can hear you.
Deputy Commissioner Hudson here, we can hear you.
Great, thank you. And Mr.
Yeah.
Warboys?
Yeah, good morning, Gary Warboys. I can hear reasonably well.
Great, thank you. We are now live.
Okay, we're all ready to go. All witnesses will be sworn prior to giving evidence. First, starting with Deputy Commissioner Warboys, could you please state your full name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation that has been emailed to you by the Secretariat?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you. Gary Warboys, W-O-R-B-O-Y-S, Deputy Commissioner, Deputy Secord, oath. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you. Mr. Walton, could you please state your full name and position title and swear either an oath or an affirmation?
Yes, Mark Stephen Walton, Assistant Commissioner of Police. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you. Mr. Cook, could you please state your full name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation?
Scott Cook, Assistant Commissioner of Police. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you. And Mr. Hudson, could you please state your full name and position title and swear either an oath or an affirmation?
Yes, sir, I'll take the oath. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you very much. Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Deputy Commissioner Hudson, I'd like to follow up some of the questions asked earlier and explore some comments that you made in the Sydney Morning Herald on August the 26th, where you said that the New South Wales Police are monitoring 1,000 on, quote, terrorism continuum as neo-Nazi risk rises. Is that an increase? Is that a decrease? How does that compare to the pre-COVID environment?
Thank you for the question, sir. I think we have seen an increase during the COVID environment. To put those comments in some form of context, I was referring to the entire terrorism continuum that we monitor. We have a very advanced system known as the Known Entity Management System, where we have 4 tiers.
I'm sorry, sir, could you repeat that again? I couldn't hear that for. Sorry.
We have a very elaborate system known as the Known Entity Management System to monitor individuals. That particular system has 4 tiers. Obviously, Tier 1 poses the most threat to New South Wales. We have a number of people in that, escalating to
or de-escalating to Tier 4, where by far the majority of those individuals are, who do deserve some degree of monitoring. So what we've tried to do over the last 4 to 5 years is capture all individuals onto a common database to manage the risk and the threat that they pose at different times, put trigger mechanisms in place to alert us to when their circumstances change and it's possible that their activity may extend to more violent behaviour, so that we can intervene at the most appropriate and the earliest opportunity. So whilst I stand by the number of people that we monitor through that system, probably the Tier 1 and Tier 2 individuals are of most concern to us, and that would number approximately 80 individuals.
I'm sorry, sir, you'll have to repeat that figure.
80.
Oh, 80. Oh, okay. So 1,000 overall, but you would say that there are 80 in Tier 1 and Tier 2. Now, those 80, those would be people who reside in New South Wales or make threats into New South Wales.
That's correct, yes, and it's a mixture of either ideological or religious extremism.
Right. When you say ideological and religious extremism, briefings I've received from experts who study this area say that the groups could be divided into 3: far left, far right, and religious-based extremism. Is that correct?
The national standards, as dictated by the Commonwealth, splits it into 2, either ideological, which includes either right or left-wing extremism, and religious extremism. That's our national standard.
Okay, of those 80 that you refer to in Tier 1 and Tier 2, are they ideological or religious extremism?
So there is a mixture of both. Obviously, we don't we deal with threat, not necessarily focus on one particular strain of the environment. We look at who poses the most threat, and they are ranked based upon that threat. There are both religious extremists in that group and also ideological extremists.
Right. Now, of the ideological extremists, have they, to use a phrase, have they flourished or increased in the COVID environment, or have their numbers continued? It's just that we see more of them now. Can you give me a bit of a context?
We have seen more activity in that space. A lot of the activity in relation to ideological extremism is conducted electronically over the internet, engaging with people overseas, engaging in chat rooms, engaging in different forms of social media, venting their particular viewpoints of the world and what their solutions to that particular situation is. We monitor that environment. We have seen a greater number of people come in from the periphery of that environment to engage in conversations and to engage in what I would say undesirable behaviour. However, at a point when we think that will result in violence, we interdict.
Now, these groups, we've heard quite a bit recently about these groups communicating through encrypted communication. Is that correct?
There are some groups that do communicate via that method, yes.
Yes. Okay. Now the recent rallies that we've seen, the July rallies, and the rallies that we saw yesterday. Now, from experts in the field have said that 69 rallies is quite a well-coordinated effort on the far rights or people who operate in this area. Would you agree with that observation that yesterday's 69 it took a bit of coordination?
I think the riots or the protests yesterday were well coordinated to get that number of protests conducted on the same day at similar locations around the state. I think that We can talk about right-wing extremism. In our environment, we talk about anti-establishment. A lot of the protests that were conducted yesterday and have been previously have not been right-wing extremism per se. There's been a mixture of attendees, including left-wing extremists, right-wing extremists, and what we refer to as anti-establishment protesters. So all of those are obviously of interest to us.
But sir, to your credit, or to the police service's credit too, that you responded promptly to all 69 protests in that.
Out of the terrorism environment, through our State Intelligence Command, we have a Public Order and Events Intelligence Unit, which was established last year. They monitor online activity in relation to the protest space. At the moment, they're conducting meetings 3 days a week, which escalate to more frequently every day prior to what we become aware of being a major protest activity in this current environment. And you've probably seen that type of escalation play out over 2 weekends when we had over 1,200 police deployed in the field, and very much deployed our mantra of prevention and disruption rather than just responding. So we tried to prevent those protests in the current environment with health orders and disrupt those protests rather than simply respond to those protests. And I think that worked very well.
Yeah, I acknowledge that, and I acknowledge that your response yesterday was very, very efficient. Now, I understand that they're regrouping for September the 18th. When you said disruption, so without going into fine details, but how, in fact, do you disrupt or thwart their activity?
I think some of our strategies have been well published through the media. We try and prevent the central business district of Sydney has been the focal point up till now, and we saw last month quite violent protests where 3,500 people made it into the city. Post that, we've taken a very proactive response in relation to preventing people from actually getting into the CBD without a valid reason, so that they try and disable their ability to protest. We do that through monitoring the train network, through enforcing of public health orders, to make sure that they're out with a valid excuse. We do that with vehicle checkpoints. We do that with monitoring taxis and Uber drivers and excluding them from the broader CBD, so that we can't get those large congregations of people in this current environment where they are subject to health orders.
Now, you'd be familiar with the recent 60 Minutes Sydney Morning Herald activity involving the National Socialist Network?
Yes, I am.
Yep. And there have been calls at the federal level to prescribe them or designate them as a terrorist organization. What is your professional response to doing something like that?
The National Socialist Network have a very splintered presence within New South Wales. They are much more focused in Victoria, where that story was based. We don't see, whilst we have supporters and peripheral members in New South Wales, we don't see them posing a significant threat in New South Wales that we don't have visibility over. Obviously, if the Attorney General makes recommendations to the Governor to prescribe a particular entity as a terrorist group, we are normally consulted in that process. And if asked and consulted with, we would obviously give an opinion. The rhetoric.
Sorry, sir.
The rhetoric that they espouse is certainly not that which sits well with the general community, and certainly needs to be limited.
Now,
excuse me, Walt, could I just ask witnesses to please properly identify themselves before they start to answer? Hanso's having a little bit of a trouble following you.
Oh, okay.
Please proceed, Walt.
Okay, Walt Secord. Commissioner Hudson, Deputy Commissioner Hudson, I'd like to take you to the anti-vaxxer movement that is occurring. Now, is that how does that play out in your police work?
The movement is not well coordinated. Obviously, there are people out there who have certain views in relation to the current situation, and for a long time have taken an approach for a variety of reasons of not wanting the vaccine. We haven't seen that specifically turn into violent protests. However, we have seen some fairly diverse viewpoints espoused in relation to 5G towers causing the current crisis, and some attacks on 5G communications towers around the state, some protest activity in relation to the establishment of 5G towers. However, by way of a specific threat to New South Wales, the anti-vaxxers, whilst having been totally allowed, obviously, to voice their opinion, have not posed a significant threat to our state.
Walt is,
Just Mr. Secord we've lost.
Disappeared by the look of it. Would you like to ask a question, Adam? Are you back, Walt?
Hello.
Yes, is Walt back?
No, I think can you hear us?
Oh.
Walt? No.
Hello.
Yeah,
yes, I can.
You've been a bit.
Sorry about that, Commissioner Hudson. So, have you actually seen that sometimes the far right activity has actually jumped on board, so to speak, piggybacked on things like the anti-vaccination movement to further their activity?
I think there's a milieu of different groups that will take any opportunity to voice their opinion and align with a different cause. We see that in the right-wing extremist space, where, and you mentioned the National Socialist Network previously, where individuals will, that environment is exceptionally fluid, and people will change allegiances to different right-wing groups very quickly. Right-wing groups, extremist groups, will dissipate very quickly and new splinter groups form.
I'm sorry, I can't hear any of this. Sorry, Mr. Chair, are other participants having difficulty hearing the answers? No. Okay, I'm sorry, Adam, if you could be in a position to resume, I'm going to jump off and come back on.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Commissioner.
I think it's your connection, Walt.
Thank you. Okay.
Can I be heard, Mr. Chair?
Yep, please proceed.
To the Police Commissioner, what criteria is applied to determine the involvement of the Police Fixated Persons Unit in any matter?
I'll take that question first, sir, and I'll pass over to Mr. Walton, who's sitting next to me, who oversights that unit.
Okay.
But there is a criteria and a protocol and a form of assessment through the intelligence, the terrorism intelligence section of the Counter-Terrorism Command prior to an investigation being taken on. But I'll hand over to Mr. Walton to run through that. And there's an existing set of standing operating procedures which should be abided by in that process. But Mr. Walton?
So, Mark Walton, yes, there is a fairly recent history in relation to the management of fixated persons here in New South Wales and Australia. It flows from a program, the Fixated Persons Threat Assessment Centre, that came out of the UK from 2006, and the Australian programs have flowed from a Queensland trial in 2014. Essentially, referrals are made into our terrorism intelligence unit, who assess the information that has been provided. there's a panel that assesses that information, determine the appropriate course as to where that work should be performed. Often with our partnership from New South Wales Health and representation from the Chief Mental Health Officer, police conduct is limited and health options are applied in relation to people that have a mental health history and are unwell, and their fixation is linked to their mental health condition. At times, those cases are referred to local area commands to work through, and the more complex cases are referred to the fixated persons unit who conduct those investigations.
So is it fair to assume there's a fair process to be followed before the fixated persons unit is used in any particular matter?
Yes.
Can you tell the committee how the fixated persons unit came to be involved in the taking of action against Mr. Christo Lanka?
That matter, which you're aware is before the court, so yeah, I certainly, sorry, I need to take care in relation to the detail of that answer, but how did it come to the fixated persons unit?
Yeah, what was the process?
Yes, the history is that in December of 2020, Mr. Shane Brady, the Associate Director of Strategic Security at the Department of Premier and Cabinet, made a referral to the Sydney City Police Area Command, so the command that covers the area, the geography that we're in now. They initiated that report going on the system due to the nature of the alleged harassment of a high office holder, which the Deputy Premier fits the definition of. It was referred through the process to the Terrorism Intelligence Unit. The information was assessed. The panel assessed the nature of the incidents that had been referred, and the fixated persons unit commenced an investigation.
Now, I think you said that there were criteria and a sort of a charter for the activities of the unit. Are those publicly available?
No, they're not.
Are you able to supply them to this committee so we could review them?
I'd certainly take that on notice to provide those standard operating procedures, sir.
Okay. Can you inform the committee whether the Deputy Premier, Mr. Barilaro, or any person in his office sought the involvement of the fixated persons unit in relation to Mr. Lanka's matter?
I have no information to suggest that occurred. There has certainly been, contact between the Deputy Premier's office and the investigators, which is to be expected in the course of an investigation and in the course of a victim and investigator contact.
All right. Well, if you could take my question on notice and give a completer answer, that would be good. My next question is whether Mr. Barilaro or any person in his office made a complaint to police about Mr. Lanka and his activities, or did the police act of their own accord in this matter?
The referral, as I've outlined, initially came from Mr. Brady, and the investigation commenced from that point.
Right. So does that mean the police acted of their own accord?
Well, I think it's more fairer to say that Mr. Barilaro's office or someone provided concerns or allegations that were then referred via Mr. Brady in the first instance.
Okay, and I think I've asked you to see if you could take on notice whether you could supply the committee a copy of the sort of criteria used by the unit, its sort of charter of activities.
Yes.
Thank you. I think my time's up.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cook, to you. Can you give me an update on the community portal launched by the Firearms Registry in March this year, where it's up to and what's happening with it?
Thank you, Mr. Borsak. For the record, Scott Cook is my name. The gun safe portal As you would be aware, it was launched for the dealers in New South Wales, firearms dealers in New South Wales last October. Since that date, there's been over 42,000 transactions where those dealers have in lifetime transferred firearms and sold firearms. That process went through a reconciliation with dealers so that the registry's holdings are matched exactly with the dealers' holdings from the outset, and so that significantly reduced different views on what dealers should or should not be holding at any point in time. So that's been operating very well. There's been fabulous feedback from the dealers. We've made some modifications to that system, and most recently we've added the Amnesty aspect to the dealers portal for the National Firearms Amnesty, which commenced on the 1st of July. That addition to GunSafe has been well received and well used and has gone off without a hitch. Additionally, as you'd be aware, in February of this year, we launched the online licences and renewals, permits to acquire, change of address, safe storage, components of the GunSafe system. There's been some 62,000 transactions that have occurred, most of them occurring within 6 weeks, many occurring within 10 days. And that system's operating very well. There's been a couple of small hiccups where we've taken feedback from licence holders and others, and we've made minor modifications to that system. The GunSafe system is continuing to evolve. The next phase of GunSafe looks at accountabilities for the Firearm Registry and publication of data, etc. So those accountability modules are currently being built, which will enable us to provide the community and internally within the Firearms Registry and to the wider police force accurate lifetime data about performance. Additionally, there's a further business case currently being considered for the second phase of GunSafe, which will flow into next year, which will focus on bringing clubs online, ranges online. It'll also focus on further work within estate activity. We're a long way progressed on that. At the moment, we have agreements with Victoria. We have data transfer with Victoria. We're close with Queensland. The ACT is on board. Border forces engaged with us so that we will hopefully in due course be able to track firearms from the time they enter the country. And then next month I'll be engaging with South Australia as well. So GunSafe, that new portal is working very effectively, but as I said, it's still under development. I think it'll revolutionise how we manage the regulation of firearms in New South Wales.
Thanks, Mr. Scott. Further, how many licences and permits to acquire, etc. applications are still caught up with the ongoing backlog? When do you expect to get it cleared?
Yeah, okay. So when we went live with GunSafe for licences in February 25th this year, there's no backlog from that point other than within that 35-day KPI, or unless we're waiting on the customer to provide further information back to us. Prior to 25th of February this year, there's a group of licence holders who were caught in an 18-month period leading up to that, which we would class as the backlog. There is about, in rough terms, 2,700 new licence applications waiting to be completed, and there is approximately 500 renewal applications waiting to be completed. I anticipate the renewal applications will be completed within the next month or so, and I anticipate that the backlog in the new applications will be completed before the end of the year. We currently have an additional 10 staff working from Sydney on that particular backlog, and that's progressing quite well. But unfortunately for those people who applied in January, for example, just before we launched GunSafe, it's been a considerable wait, an unacceptable wait. But I think with confidence by this time in 6 months, there will be no backlog.
Mr. Scott, I think the Firearms Registry used to publish a KPI reference chart. I'm not sure whether that was online or how it was actually accessed. I haven't seen that for a while. Is that still available?
No, it's not available. I took it down, and I did that because I didn't have enough confidence in the data that we're presenting. And so what we're building now within GunSafe is a reliable way of gleaning lifetime data, and it's our intent to publish that data so that the public can see what's going on in real time, and so that I can present that to you and to others in the Parliament and to the community as being accurate information. And so hopefully that'll be up and running, certainly, if not by the end of the year, certainly in the early part of next year.
Okay, yeah, we'll look forward to that. Can you give us an update on the status of the Firearms Amnesty at the moment? Is that a question?
Yes, the amnesty is going quite well, given that we're in COVID, and I think that's perhaps impacted it a little bit. There's been a significant number of transactions with dealers in terms of surrendering of firearms in rough numbers, and I'd have to take on notice if you want particular numbers, but in rough numbers.
Could you take that on notice so I can get some actual numbers, please?
Yes, certainly, I can do that.
Oh, yeah, if you've got rough numbers, yep.
Oh, sorry.
Just for now, yep.
Yeah, just roughly about 1,700 firearms have been handed in to dealers, and at least 500 firearms have been handed into police. There is in some circumstances where the firearms are handed into dealers that may be prohibited, the police will go and collect that from dealers. So there's a duplicate count there that we have to rectify, and we can do that quite easily. So I will do that prior to providing you with the actual numbers. But at this stage, given COVID, I think that's not a bad achievement. I think we're miles ahead of every other state in the country in terms of people handing firearms in.
Thanks very much. Can you give the committee an update on the firearms safe storage inspection processes? How many inspections have been conducted so far in the latest round?
So far this calendar year, we're up to about 16,000. That's 4 times the number that we did 3 years ago. In fact, I think it's almost a record in terms of recent history about our commitment to making sure that firearms are stored safely in New South Wales. Otherwise, that we've seen over the last 4 years, we've seen a halving in the number of thefts from rural and remote properties and other properties. I think our investment in safe storage and making sure that people are compliant with safe storage is paying off. I think it underpins the entire regulatory system that we're running in terms of firearms. And so I'm very glad to see that 16,000 this year has been achieved. I think we could probably do better if it wasn't for COVID. But I have to acknowledge the work being done by all the police who are being tasked to do this in addition to all their other duties that they have to do. They've really embraced this, and I think that's probably attributed to the Commissioner's focus on firearms and to the sponsorship of firearms within the organisation and the understanding across the board about how important safe storage is.
Well, yeah, I mean, 16,000 is a good number, but in the light of how many actual licences are out there, nearly 250,000, it's really a small proportion, considering the level of safe storage that has to be provided by everybody. Are you doing that safe storage inspections on a rolling basis, or you're choosing certain groups or certain individuals, or how does that actually work?
So it's risk-based in many regards. I recently instructed all police to focus on firearms licence holders who have more than 20 firearms. We're about 2/3 the way through those particular licence holders, but quite separate to that, the region commanders operate their own regional operations, such as Operation Armour and other things that are also centred around safe storage. So look, we aim to get the premises and the locations and the quantities that indicate a higher level of risk done first. And so that's been the priority, because in our minds, if someone's got 100 firearms and they're stolen, that represents a far greater risk to the community than a single firearm that may be stolen. And so we're trying to do it completely based around risk, but we're not interfering with local operations, because there may be local needs for local commanders around safe storage that they think is a priority.
Thank you. In an article in the Daily Telegraph on the 18th of August 2021, a journalist attributed to Superintendent Cameron Lindsay this statement: "The gun safe system was one of the major changes to the registry, which include formal training for the first time for staff when deciding who will get a licence." Was this an accurate report from the journalist?
Well, the registry is currently going through a business improvement process which commenced in early April this year. That process has seen a complete overhaul of how the registry conducts all its functions from the bottom. It's highlighted a number of areas where further training is required, and all staff are being provided with additional training around decision making, around process, around their standard operating procedures. There's been extensive work done on cultural change within the registry, and I have to say that the staff at the registry have significantly embraced the change. I think they've looked forward to this sort of a change, and there's been a marked improvement, not just in performance, but in their understanding of how important what they do is and how important it is to the community of New South Wales. So yes, there's ongoing training, and there'll be further training rolled out over the next 6 to 12 months.
Do you know what the ratio of Queensland residents work in the registry as compared to New South Wales residents?
It's about 15%.
15%. Now, have those people been able to work, being locked down in Queensland?
Currently, those people are vaccinated, as I understand, and they have permits. Where we can do other workarounds with work from home, which is limited given the registry systems and processes, we've done that. But I think we're the only registry that has been functioning in a full capacity in the entire country for the last 2 years, despite interruptions to COVID. So I think that's an achievement, and I think that the registry staff need to be applauded for that.
Well, you've got to the nub of the question. Okay, thank you. Paragraph 525 of the New South Wales Coroner's Report on the inquest into the deaths of Jack and Jennifer Edwards mentions that the Firearms Registry has a policy of treating apprehended violence orders that have been revoked and dismissed by the New South Wales Court as active AVOs. What is the registry's policy regarding expired AVOs?
So this is quite complex. As you'd be aware, in 2016, the domestic violence legislation changed. And when it changed the jurisdiction of the local court. So this only affects final orders that have expired, and people who have sought revocation following the expiry in the local court cannot do that. There's a jurisdictional error that's occurred there. The Crown Solicitor has advised on. In those circumstances, and only those circumstances, the revocation is not recognised by the registry. On the other hand, if they had taken that revocation application to the district court, it would be recognised because the district court has the appropriate jurisdiction. So it's quite complex, and it's quite complex legally, and it's only a small part of the business. But in general terms, revoked orders are not considered as disqualifying offences. They're considered in terms of fit and proper person. So the policy is not to simply ignore everything and do what we want. The registry is complying with the law and complying with the Crown Solicitor's advice that's been provided to them.
Okay, my time's up.
Oh, thanks, Chair. Yeah, thank you all for attending this afternoon and the work you've been doing. Mr. Walton, this might be appropriately addressed by you. Can you tell us what the criteria is for a matter being investigated by the Fixated Persons Unit? I know you gave some answers to Mr. Searle, but can you tell us what the criteria are?
I haven't got the SOPs in front of me, so I'd have to sort of collectively give you my recollection of that. As I said, there is a process that vets and determines what cases are done by the Fixated Persons Unit. Essentially, it does hang on that someone's fixated, there's ongoing harassment, and typically they are high office holders, or there's a criteria that allows us in circumstances to determine someone who has been, I suppose, overwhelmingly harassed by someone for the unit to undertake that investigation. Typically, they're more complex matters that require significant evidence gathering and being able to present that material to the courts.
So it's not just any concern raised by a public figure like an MP or the Deputy Premier. There has to be a very real continuing pattern of behaviour. Is that your understanding?
That's typical. That there's an assessment that it's a serious ongoing issue, and often a threat of violence is a threshold that we move towards.
And indeed, I could assume there would be circumstances where a very serious threat of violence of itself would be sufficient, and you wouldn't need an ongoing series of events if there was a very serious threat of violence. Would that be right?
Indeed, and in the current environment, particularly online, we are seeing a lot of people venting their frustrations, whether it's anti-government, anti-policy, or anti-establishment, and those matters are again being assessed and determined where that investigation is appropriately conducted, given the volume. The bulk of them are being done by local police, and in many instances, when they're engaged by the police, they remove that post. There's a level of contrition and essentially a warning's taken.
So in many cases, even when there's quite serious threats, it's addressed by police approaching the person, making it known that they are being observed, and a caution is given, and that's often how these matters are addressed. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I wouldn't say serious threat. If there was a serious threat, formal action would be taken.
Is it part of the Fixated Persons Unit's role to police the political criticisms of members of Parliament, even quite robust political criticisms of members of Parliament? Is that in any way part of the Fixated Persons Unit's role or parameters?
No.
You see, Ms. Walner, I'm having difficulty understanding how, given the nature of that evidence, that the Fixated Persons Unit was in any way involved with the investigation of Christo Lanka. It doesn't seem to meet any of those thresholds. And indeed, on one view of it, meets one of the exclusions.
Well, it was assessed as meeting that. It was certainly an ongoing allegations of harassment, and this matter is before the court, Mr. Shoebridge. So I'm concerned that if we start to get into the detail of those allegations, we may be subdued.
I'm really interested in the role of the Fixated Persons Unit, and not indeed the court proceedings. Have you reviewed the decision by the Fixated Persons Unit to become involved in this matter?
I haven't reviewed the decision. I have looked at the material.
And have you satisfied? I'll come back to you in a sec. Have you satisfied yourself, having reviewed that material, that it met the criteria for investigation by the Fixated Persons Unit under the SOPs, the Standard Operating Procedures?
I'd have to take that on notice to clearly benchmark it, but as I sit here, I'm comfortable with the decision for the Fixated Persons Unit's involvement in this matter.
Sorry, Mr. Hudson, you may have wanted to add something, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Shoebridge. I'd like to clarify something. Mr. Walton was actually on leave, I think, when the gentleman was arrested. I did question the process. I forwarded a memorandum to the acting commander of the Counter-Terrorism and Special Tactics Command, asking him to review what happened. I don't think appropriate processes were properly followed in that assessment. Having said that, I think if the appropriate processes were followed, we would have the same result. I was more concerned about the process that was followed rather than the outcome. I don't think it would have changed the fact that the Fixated Persons Unit would have become involved in the matter. I don't think it would have changed the fact that we would have preferred charges against the gentleman. But because of the sensitivities around this, we are quite strong on the fact that the process has to be followed, and if we identify incidents where that doesn't happen, we will question it and correct it.
Thanks, Mr. Hudson. In what regard did you form a view that incorrect process had been applied in this matter?
Well, my recollection is that the referral that Mr. Walton referred to earlier was not in relation to Christo Lanka. It was in relation to an associate of his. That was under investigation. and is currently still under investigation. There had been contact, and that went through the appropriate referral pathways, and the investigation was being conducted by the Fixated Persons Unit, and that involved allegations made by the Deputy Premier. Christo Lanctor's matter came around at the same time that matter was being determined, and because there was a conduit of contact between the Deputy Premier's office and the Fixated Persons Unit, there was some contact made, and I think the Fixated Persons Unit treated it as an escalation of the same incident rather than a separate incident with a separate suspect. And I think, in my opinion, it should have been treated as a separate suspect, go through the same process that we normally do and assessed by the Terrorism Intelligence Unit prior to the Fixated Persons Unit taking that on board as an investigation. As I said before, it would not have changed the outcome. If we had gone down that path, it would have been a matter that would have been investigated by the Fixated Persons Unit. I think it would have been a matter still that would end up before the courts, as it is now. But in my mind, and I know Commissioner Fuller agrees with this and Mr. Walt agrees with this, we have to ensure that the process for jobs coming into that unit are followed. So, as I said, that matter, as Mr. Walton's alluded to, that matter is now before the court, and we will be prosecuting that as we would any other matter.
So, Mr. Hudson, are you saying the Fixated Persons Unit made the decision to charge Mr. Lanka, having wrongly assumed it was part of an escalating pattern of conduct? Is that your evidence?
I think it's the gentleman is linked to a matter they were already investigating, and they saw it as a continuance of the same behaviour rather than an isolated incident. However, individually, as the matter is still under investigation, the initial matter is still under investigation. So Christo Lanctor's matter was more clear cut, and action was taken more immediately.
Deputy Commissioner Hudson, you understand the very real concern in the community where people have engaged in robust satire of politicians end up finding themselves charged with criminal offences by police. You would understand the very real concern in the community, and I'll just be clear, it's a concern that I very, very much share. Do you understand the level of concern about this matter?
Totally understand the issue, Mr. Shoebridge, and there is a line that will ultimately be determined by the court as to whether that line has been crossed or not. That will be a determination by the court.
But in this case, police made a decision to have the Fixated Persons Unit involved, which is effectively there for serious political related crimes. And that seems to have been, you accept now, an error on the part of the New South Wales Police. Is that right?
No, I don't see the Fixated Persons Unit investigating this matter as being a mistake. I consider the pathway that caused them to investigate the matter and the SOPs, standard operating procedures that currently exist to ensure that inappropriate matters are not investigated by that unit. We're not following.
Mr. Hudson, just on that, as I understand it, and maybe the police commissioner can correct me, the Fixated Persons Unit was established just before the coroner's report into the Lint Cafe siege came out, and at the time it was indicated its activities would be directed towards preventing terrorism and tackling people who were potentially violent. Can you tell the committee, at least roughly, on what basis did Mr. Lanka's activities bring it within the scope of the Fixated Persons Unit? I mean, is the suggestion that his activities were terrorism related?
The Fixated Persons Unit sits under the Counter-Terrorism and Special Tactics Command, Mr. Searle.
That's right.
However, it has a broad remit looking at, as Mr. Walt alluded to earlier, for issues that would come out of a fixated threat assessment process. So there's a number of people involved at different stages, depending upon the nature of the job, including a fixated persons panel, which includes psychologists that can make referrals. But it has a fairly broad remit to investigate matters where it is determined that some form of fixation on an individual or a group or an entity could lead to potential violence.
Sure, but I mean, it's a
terrorist
counterterrorism command. It obviously would have to be at a very high level to warrant the involvement of that body, wouldn't it?
I think since inception in 2017, the fixated persons unit has investigated over 600 matters.
Mm-hmm.
And I think charged over 150 people now. But I can get those more specific details to you. I can take those on notice.
Please do.
But there's a variety of individuals that have been charged by that unit. Their commonality is the fixation, whether it be terrorism, fixated on a politician, fixated on a movie star, which we've had as well. The commonality is the fixation, not necessarily whether it's political, terrorism related, or what else.
All right, in which case is its location in the counter-terrorism command an entirely appropriate one, given, from what you said, the very broad spectrum of operational activities it's dealt with? I mean, where it is now, it looks like it deals with terrorism, counter-terrorism, very serious threats of political violence. And there's been a lot of concern around its use in this case. There's been a former DPP's made comment, lawyers have made comments, not about the activities. I mean, if there's criminal activities, that's one issue. And we're not talking about the proceedings at the moment, but we're just talking about the use of this unit. Do you understand the sort of concerns that have been expressed about the use of the unit in this case?
I totally understand, and as I said, I caused the acting commander of counter-terrorism to review the process in this particular matter. As I've indicated, I don't think it would have changed the outcome. I think the matter, as I understand it, that's currently before the courts, is appropriately investigated by the Fixated Persons Unit and appropriate actions taken, which we are continuing to prosecute. But I can understand the concern that people have raised.
Certainly. And do I understand from your evidence that the concerns about Mr. Lanka were in the nature of fixation rather than in the nature of threats of violence or any kind of political issue?
That's correct.
Okay. In which case, again, do you think that perhaps there should be a different unit located outside of counter-terrorism that should deal with matters that don't involve terrorism or terrorism-related issues?
As other fixated units around the world, emanating out of fixated threat assessment centres and fixated threat assessment centre processes, there is a strong link at times with terrorism. Once assessed there's a very strong mechanism of assessment of threat and risk through the Counter-Terrorism Command, which is applied through the Terrorism Intelligence Unit. I don't have the details with me, but not all matters assessed by that unit and referred to that unit. Not all investigations are conducted by that unit. As Mr. Walt alluded to earlier, many of those matters are referred to local area commands, police area commands or police districts for investigation, as it is determined through that panel process that investigation better sits within that environment rather than within the counter-terrorism command.
Okay, and your evidence is that you're utterly confident that all of the appropriate processes and filters were used in this particular matter?
I think that The way that the investigation was conducted, came to notice, was reviewed. I reminded the unit through the commander, the acting commander of counter-terrorism, to follow the standing operating procedures, and I think those standing operating procedures are valid and need to be adhered to.
Are you aware whether the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission is looking at the investigation of this matter?
Am I aware if they are? No, I'm not aware if they are.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, some of the criticism has been that essentially Mr. Lenker and his employer were really engaged in political scrutiny of the government, and that the use of the Fixated Persons Unit in this matter has taken on a, if you like, a political flavour. Can you tell us whether the complaint made by Mr. Barilaro, his office, specifically sought the involvement of the Fixated Persons Unit, or was it just generally a complaint to police?
The initial complaint, the first complaint was made to, as Mr. Walt said, to the City Central Police Area Command, not to the Counter-Terrorism Command.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I might move on from this interesting topic because I think you've taken some questions on notice and you're going to supply us with certain documents that we can have a look at the charter given to the unit. Mr. Hudson, earlier this year you gave evidence to a cyber security inquiry conducted by the Legislative Council, and you indicated that there were something like nearly 13,000 cyber incidents over the previous 12 months to your giving of evidence, and that these were complaints made to the New South Wales Police. Can you tell us this year how many complaints have been made to police in the nature of cyber crime or cyber incidents?
The data I relied upon in that particular inquiry is information that comes to us through the Commonwealth System Report Cyber.
Mm-hmm.
Without having specific numbers in front of me, which I can get you, I know that it's in excess of 1,000 reports a month and increasing.
Yes, I think your evidence was that there was an increase of about 7 or 8% every month. Has that trend continued throughout 2021?
Yes, it has, and through periods of lockdown, we actually see a slight increase on that. So I'll have to get more current data to you.
Okay, if you could, in the 2020-21 financial year, we're told the Privacy Commissioner received more than 200 reports of state government agencies having data breaches. Have any of those involved the police force, his own infrastructure?
In relation to our infrastructure being breached?
Yes, in relation to your infrastructure being breached or attacked.
We have frequent attacks on our infrastructure, and they are battered away, for want of a better term, through the processes that we have. We're actually increasing our cyber security presence and capabilities at the moment. We have an investment from government through the Digital Restart Fund, where we are establishing more stringent processes, and including an operations centre based at Homebush, totally focused on the security of our systems, bearing in mind the level of information that some of our systems hold and the information that we are relied upon by other government agencies and our Commonwealth partners in law enforcement and indeed overseas to protect. So it is a particular focus of us to ensure that our systems are as rigorous as they can be. As I said, including that $23 million investment that we're implementing at the moment.
Sorry, what was that figure? I just couldn't hear it properly.
$23 million.
Okay. And is that from the $180 million the government has allocated to public service agencies to upgrade their security and their IT capability?
I believe so. I wasn't involved in the application, but I believe through speaking to our IT people that it was an application made to the Digital Restart Fund.
Mr. Hudson, you agreed with the proposition during that inquiry that if people are going to trust the police to investigate cybersecurity, they need to be satisfied the police themselves have proper cybersecurity controls. And I think you gave evidence that last year there had been 58 significant attacks on police infrastructure and 200 phishing attacks each week. Can you give this inquiry an update as to the nature and types of attacks on police infrastructure and whether any of them have been successful?
To my knowledge, no attack has ever been successful in the New South Wales police systems. But as I said before, people frequently attempt to get into our systems. So, as I said, that investment that I referred to, the establishment of the operations centre at Homebush, the increase in software capability to detect, the increase in resourcing, physical human resourcing in this space is all part of what we do to protect our systems. I think we are one of the agencies within New South Wales, as other law enforcement agencies are around the world and sort of around Australia, particularly vulnerable to people trying to get in. So it's important that we do put up those walls to prevent that. And I think we're up until this point, we've been very successful in doing that. But those phishing attacks and those intrusion attempts upon our systems continue to occur. I don't have the numbers at me. I'm not in that space at the moment, but I don't have the numbers, but they continue to occur.
All right. The COPS, the COPS database, I think Ms. Boyd asked some questions earlier. I think some $23 million since 2018 has been used or spent to upgrade that. But during the cybersecurity inquiry, Deputy Commissioner Lanyon indicated that there was an estimated $1 billion required to implement a proper new platform for that database and police security. That's an awful lot of money. Can you indicate over what time frame that money is required, and are you on track to make sure that you've actually got the resources necessary to make safe the police cyber infrastructure?
Sir, I don't have a great deal of visibility over the replacement for COPS. It's not a project that I've been involved in specifically. I have some high-level knowledge and briefings through the Commissioner's executive team. My understanding is that the program to replace COPS, whilst done in different stages, is going to take approximately 15 years to complete. But that is based on priorities, which I have never been briefed on, apart from the areas that sit under my area of control, which is forensic and technical services, replacing our forensic system. So I'm sure that question can certainly be taken on notice, and a more detailed response be provided with timeframes in relation to IPOS, but I have no knowledge of that.
All right. Well, if you could take that on notice, or unless the police commissioner can provide further information at the moment, I'm happy for that to be taken on notice.
Thank you, Mr. Searle. I'll jump in. Deputy Commissioner Hudson, I apologize during the last bracket of questions that I asked because I lost the internet connection, so I didn't hear your answer entirely. So if there's a repetition, I apologize. This morning, Deputy Commissioner Mal Lanyon on 2GB said that the recent protests involved a foreign actor. Can you elaborate on what was he referring to?
I didn't hear that, Mr. Secord, and I wish I had spoken to Mr. Lanyon this morning, but I have not been briefed on that, and I can answer that.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to follow up on a question from Robert Borsak when he asked about the Firearms Amnesty. A number of years ago, there was something called a bomb amnesty, B-O-M-B, bomb. I'm not sure who to direct this to, but if there's anyone here today who has knowledge, in fact, did anything eventuate involving the bomb amnesty?
Being the oldest person present, Mr. Secord, I do remember a little bit, and I think it was an explosives amnesty. I think there was some explosives returned that had been used, this year's mining explosives around the state. I think that was actually coordinated by one of Mr. Cook's current commands, the Security Licensing and Enforcement Directorate, but I don't have any details of that. That was some years ago, but I believe there was, as I said, unused mining explosives that have been sitting around that were returned and ultimately destroyed through the rescue and bomb disposal unit that sits under Mr. Walt.
Okay, if you could take it on notice and come back to us with the results of that amnesty. Also, are you aware that in Queensland, the Queensland government has introduced legislation involving people attacking police dogs and police horses, and has there been any work or discussion in New South Wales in this area?
Again, Mr. Secord, they're not areas that currently sit under me, the horses and the dogs, although I did at one time historically. I am unaware of any changes to the current legislation in relation to the protection of our police animals. I'll have to take that on notice to see if there's any current work being done, but I am unaware of any.
Deputy Commissioner Hudson, before the disruption of the internet link, you made reference to some 5G tower attacks. Can you elaborate on those and explain the context of those attacks?
I'm aware of one arson attack on one, which Mr. Walt might be able to elaborate on because I asked him to have a look at this matter. Also protests up in the Byron Bay area about the establishment of new towers became a bit of an issue for us, and there was a bit of a worldwide trend which we thought might replicate itself within Australia and in New South Wales in relation to the destruction of towers. Mr. Walt, I'm not too sure if you've refreshed your recollection recently, but I know that you did some work on this previously.
Yeah, so we've had one incident earlier this year where a tower was damaged by fire. My recollection is there's an arrest that occurred for that malicious damage. It was led by the Police Area Command with the support of police from my command area. More broadly, the 5G is another ideological issue at the moment. There are some extremists, particularly overseas, that have engaged in violent behaviour and damage to infrastructure. We haven't seen that translate to a high degree here in New South Wales or Australia, but it's certainly a potential, and as I say, it's one of a multitude of ideologies, so-called salad bar of ideologies that some people are picking up and often pick up multiple ideologies and merge them based on a conspiratorial consumption online.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner, and I think that concludes our time.
To you, Mr. Hutt.
Sorry, you go.
Yeah, I might go first, David. Mr. Hudson, the New South Wales coroner was rightfully highly critical of the registry and individual employees for the systemic failures of the registry. Can you tell me whether the persons identified by their initials in the coroner's report still are working at the registry? And I obviously don't expect you to know this immediately. BW, LM, HT, TM, HP, AH, NW, and HT.
As I said here, Mr. Borsak, I couldn't tell you that. I know that some people that were criticised through that process did leave the registry, some remained, and some remained off sick. Last time I checked, Mr. Cook might have a better update on that, but I think there is a mixture of departures and leaves of absence amongst those people that were mentioned.
Thanks, Deputy. I don't have further update on that. I think if I could, Mr. Borsak, take that on notice, I'm happy to provide the information, but the Deputy's summary is correct. Some have left, some have been sick, and some have continued to work at the registry.
All right, well, if you could give me the detail on notice, that'd be great. What remedial training, if any, have they received? Obviously, those that remain.
They've had extensive training. As I said earlier, the business improvement team's been up there since earlier this year. All the staff there, including those people who remain from that particular point in time, have had retraining and new training. We're looking to make that a permanent and ongoing practice about continuous development. So the registry, we will move to a form within the registry where there is ongoing updating of training, ongoing modification of systems and processes, so that we can't fall into a trap of the past where things are just done that way because they're done that way. So I have confidence that the business improvement team is implementing new regimes that will ensure that all the adjudicators at the registry are properly informed and properly trained at any given point in time.
Thank you. Is BW still employed as a supervisor at the registry?
Mr. Borsak, off the top of my head, I don't know who BW refers to. I'll have to take that on notice, if that's okay.
Okay, well, and while you do that, could you tell me about LM and HP? Are they still there?
I'll follow that up for you.
Thank you. With the Public Service Commission's capability framework that sets out core competencies for specific roles.
I'm sorry, Mr. Borsak, I didn't quite catch the question.
Sorry, yeah, I'll say again. Are you familiar with the Public Service Commission's capability framework that sets out core competencies for specific roles?
Yes, I am.
And have employees at the registry been assessed to ensure that they have the required capabilities under that capability framework?
Yeah, that's currently underway. As I said, there's been significant business improvement there. Part of that will be a structural realignment, which the Commission has approved. As that process unfolds, that realignment, every single position will have its position overview and job description brought into line with those capabilities, and each applicant and each position holder will have to meet those capabilities relative to the position that they occupy.
Thank you. How many sworn officers work at the registry now?
6.
Sorry?
6 sworn officers.
6, thank you. And what's the total headcount at the registry?
So there's 83 people at the registry, 6 sworn police, 77 civilians. There's an additional 10 civilian positions operating at Police Link, which are not attached to the registry, but do a large component of the customer service work for the registry. Their focus is on servicing the registry. And there's an additional 10 police sworn positions at Homebush, or Olympic Park, I should say, who are working currently on backlogs which exist, we discussed earlier.
Oh, okay, that's good, thanks. Now, the 10 that are not attached, are they the ones that do the back office work and at Parramatta?
No, so I'll explain that again. The 10 at Police Link are customer service officers who do basic inquiries for customers before referring any material to the registry.
Okay.
The 10 that are based at Homebush are a temporary workforce of police who have been brought in to work through those backlogs we discussed earlier. That is the applications that had existed prior to the 25th of February this year.
Thanks very much. When the registry asks for a report from a psychologist or psychiatrist asking for professional opinion on whether a licence applicant can own or use firearms safely and without risk to the public, who at the registry assesses those medical reports?
The short answer is the adjudicators, but the longer answer is we're currently very sensitive to the issues around this, and we're working with with the registry is working through how we can better approach this sensitive topic with people. It's incumbent on the registry to consider the mental health of applicants. It's a really crucial component of risk they need to manage. And so they need to seek professional advice from doctors, because they are not doctors, in regards to that individual's capacity to responsibly own a firearm or use a firearm. And so there's a lot of work going on within the registry at the moment to try and ensure that the communications that are undertaken with applicants is sensitive to their circumstances. It's not, the last thing that the people at registry want to do is offend people, but they are obliged to inquire into this sort of area. And so they're currently working on reforms about those communications, and they're looking at perhaps even a specific checklist for medical practitioners, others to answer. That will make it far clearer for the adjudicators in terms of whether the person is appropriate or not to hold a firearm licence.
So did I hear in your answer there that the registry does actually seek medical reports from medically qualified people when they're doing the assessment?
Yeah, that's correct.
So
not in all circumstances. Sorry, Mr. Borsak. Not in all circumstances. Just where there's an issue or a potential issue relating to mental health.
Oh well, yeah, that's what I'm talking about, the whole mental health area, because the feedback I'm getting in the office is that it's generally easier just for the registry to say no, go away. You've had some sort of mental health issue, or you may have a mental health issue, or someone said you've got a mental health issue. It's very hard to come back from that situation, even when you don't have a mental health any sort of mental health problem. It's not good enough for someone to simply say, "Oh, you've got a mental health issue," and then therefore their licenses and license removed, firearms confiscated. How do they come back from that? That's really the issue.
Yeah, I understand the question. In some circumstances, the registry have no prior detailed information about an individual's mental health history. But in other circumstances, for example, if there's been numerous COPS events of a person being taken to an institution or mental health episodes, it may be far easier to revoke in those or refuse in those circumstances, because it's abundantly clear of the issues. But where it's not abundantly clear, that they're required to make contact with that individual and ask for medical evidence that would support their sound mind or their ability to own a firearm and use a firearm.
In relation to judging whether a firearms licence should be retained or not, do the police take into consideration breaches of the COVID orders?
I may have to take that on notice, Mr. Borsak. In general terms, if people are issued just infringement notices, they generally wouldn't be inclusive. But if they were charged with criminal offences, then they probably would be inclusive. So I don't know that we've had anyone refused on the basis of that yet. Perhaps one or two, but I would suggest that it wouldn't be for an infringement. It would be for an arrest, an assault, something else more substantial.
Is it always the case that if you are arrested, say for example on a charge of assault, but the charge doesn't go ahead, or you are found innocent, that you could never get your licence back?
No, that's not right. If the charge didn't go ahead and there was no conviction there, that aspect would only be considered as part of the fit and proper person or public interest test. It wouldn't be considered as as part of the disqualifying test.
Can you tell me how that test works?
Well, depending on the disqualifying test is stipulated in the legislation about particular offences that exclude people. So that's a cut and dry test. The fit and proper person test is more discretionary, and will often rely on information that is not as concrete as a conviction would be. And then the overriding test is public interest test, about whether in all of the circumstances, in terms of that person's living circumstances, their well-being, their associates, etc., whether they should or should not have a firearm. So that's a highly discretionary test, and there's guidance that we give to the adjudicators there, and we've talked about this before. We've published the guidelines that they use and the instructions they use. They're on the website, but they get also further assistance through the decision-making tool that has now been refined and enhanced to make sure that they go through those three stages appropriately.
Can you make the decision-making tool public?
At this stage, it's still being reviewed. I don't know that we've made it public because we really wouldn't want it to be manipulated in some way. We've published the guidelines on how decisions are made for the information of the public. They're publicly available now. The decision-making tool, if the intricacies of that were published, I think it could open it up to misuse or manipulation. However, I'm happy to take that on notice, get some advice and come back to you.
Mr. Cook, what I'm getting at is that the fit and proper test for a firearms owner seems to be a moving feast. And it's certainly different today in a much more restricted way than it was when I first got my firearms license 35, 40 years ago. It seems to be the tests are different, and quite often I'm having people come to my office saying, well, I don't understand why I'm not a fit and proper person, and the registry isn't telling them what's going wrong or what has happened in their past. And it may be a perfectly reasonable and legitimate reason why it should be refused, but there's just no understanding of how this has been done. It's a black box, and it's changing as we go through time. Do you understand the frustration that's going on?
I certainly understand the frustration, but I think what influences that is decisions that we receive out of the NCAT sometimes bind us in terms of how we exercise those discretionary aspects. There's also other case law that comes out around fit and proper person in other aspects of the law. All of these sort of impact to some degree that moving feast you're talking about. But there's also an expectation from the community that people who have firearms are appropriately holding firearms, and I think there's been a greater focus on that in recent times. So it could just be that a combination of the reforms that we've made at the registry, the additional training, the legal position from the courts, and the expectations of the community have conspired in some way to make it more difficult than for when you obtained your licence. But look, I don't know that we should apologise for that. I take on board your point about transparency, and if we can be more transparent in terms of that decision making, then we're happy to look at that.
I only make that point because if the community understood what the requirements of a fit and proper person was, obviously not seeking to manipulate it, it might be easier for people then not to transgress it. That's all I'm saying.
I understand that. We may be able to modify the guidelines, I suspect, that and enhance that aspect of the guidelines that we publish that may be of assistance in that regard.
I'm finished, thanks.
Thanks, Chair. This may be best addressed to you, Mr. Hudson. Can you explain why it took 6 years between the handing down of the Royal Commission's findings in relation to Hillsong Church and the conduct of Brian Houston, why it took 6 years between that and the laying of charges against Brian Houston for an alleged breach of Section 316 of the Crimes Act? Can you explain the 6-year delay?
No, Mr. Shoebridge, I can't. I have no visibility over that. My understanding is that that was conducted through the police, or investigation was conducted through the Police Area Command, not one of the commands that I have visibility over. So I could not explain or in any way justify or try to justify that length of time.
Well, if not you, then Mr. Hudson, Mr. Warboys or one of the other officers here, did you have any oversight role in relation to that?
Mr. Shoebridge, Gary Warboys, no, I have no visibility of that matter.
Mr. Hudson, I'd ask you to take on notice, if you would, if there is an explanation, and provide an explanation for the 6-year delay. Would you take that on notice on behalf of the police?
Certainly, sir, I will.
Mr. Hudson, could you also take on notice, unless you know, was the New South Wales Police contacted when Mr. Houston was given permission to leave the country by the federal government? Was New South Wales Police contacted given the fact that there was an ongoing live criminal investigation against Mr. Houston?
I'll have to take that on notice, sir. I have no visibility over that.
Well, could you also take on notice whether or not New South Wales Police have commenced or are intending to commence any extradition action to get to ensure that Mr. Houston returns to the jurisdiction in order to face the charges, unless you know whether or not any extradition action has commenced?
No, I'm unaware of that, sir. I will take that on notice and we will answer it if we're able to.
Does New South Wales or Australia have an extradition treaty with Mexico if Mr. Houston is in Mexico? Are you aware of that? And if not, could you take it on notice?
I'll take it on notice, sir, yes.
This question might be best directed to you, Mr. Hudson, in the first instance, but you may be assisted by Mr. Walt. You were asked some questions about whether or not you believe the National Socialist Network should be a prescribed terrorist organisation. Is it true that you haven't yet got a view on that? Is that my understanding of your evidence to Mr. Secord?
I think that particular organisation is different to some of the other organisations that are prescribed by the Commonwealth, in that its structure is very temporary. There's a lot of members that come in and out of that particular group that sit on the periphery of that group. And the problem with prescribing temporary groups is that they will disband and create another group under another name very quickly. If there was some suggestion that process was to be undertaken, we would certainly support that. But ultimately, I'm not too sure how successful a strategy that would prove to be. That's my point. Mr. Walt might have a different view.
Just to add to that, it's quite a high threshold in relation to the listing of terrorist organisations. The proofs include directly or indirectly engaging in preparing, planning or assisting the fostering or doing of a terrorist act and advocating or doing a terrorist act. As unpleasant and as disgusting as many of the things we see NSN and other groups do, I'm not aware of them heading towards that threshold. That may in itself be an obstacle for the listing of that group.
Mr. Walton, I very much endorse your view of them as being grossly offensive, but I would suggest they go beyond that with dangerous, spreading vile, racist, right-wing, fascist, political organising messages. That would be a fair summary of what they do, isn't it? Nasty, vicious, racist, vile political organising methods.
I agree, and I certainly don't believe New South Wales Police have any reluctance for listing of those that meet threshold.
Mr. Walton, do you or Mr. Hudson know whether or not there has been any review about whether or not any New South Wales Police are in any way associated with or support or are members of any of QAnon or Sovereign Citizens or the National Socialist Network? Have you undertaken those investigations?
It would probably be a reverse, sorry, Mark Walton for the record, that would be more a reverse engineered investigative strategy. I'm not aware of any New South Wales Police coming under notice to any of those groups. Sovereign citizen is a very broad ideology, however. It's, again, there's not a formal structure. We don't sort of sign up at the RSL club for most of these ideologies, so determining who's a member or who subscribes to a certain ideology is somewhat complex. But amongst those identifiers, sovereign citizens is a very broad ideology, and there may be, there are many members of the community that subscribe to some elements of these ideologies, whether that moves them into that as a sovereign or an anti-vaxxer or a COVID denier. That's a more complex question.
Mr. Wilson, I accept you can disappear into a very disturbing black hole when you look at these organisations online. But would it be a breach of police code of conduct for New South Wales police officers to be publicly spreading and advocating anti-vaccination messages that come from QAnon, sovereign citizens and others on public podcasts and the like, whilst also serving police officers and with an obligation to enforce the public health orders? Would that be a breach of the code of conduct?
I believe in general terms, without assessing the specifics of that, yes.
Have you investigated concerns about a police officer in or about the Bathurst Command who engages in exactly that behaviour? Repeated publishing of podcasts, spreading these kinds of disinformation, anti-vax, sovereign citizens messages. Has that been brought to your attention? Have you done any investigation of it?
I'm not aware of any incident or officer at Bathurst. No.
Could you take that on notice?
Certainly.
Mr. Hudson, you determined to refuse a travel application by the Strikeforce Windara investigators in March of 2020. They were wishing to travel to South Australia to interview the complainant in that matter. Do you remember doing that?
Yes, I do.
In that regard, you refused the application because you said that it wasn't essential travel. That's your understanding, isn't it?
I think the terminology I used, Shoebridge, was insufficient detail to support it rather than refuse it. But and there were alternatives available in my mind that haven't been explored.
Well, that amount of detail is not found on your note, but insufficient detail because you believed it wasn't proven that it was essential travel. Is that your understanding?
It coincided with a conversation I had with State Crime in relation to, obviously, on the cusp of the pandemic, and we had a preclusion on overseas travel that had been announced 2 days before, and also interstate travel had escalated for approvals to Deputy Commissioners. That was one of, I think, 9 applications I received that day, and I declined all of them for the same reasons, that alternate methods of obtaining the same material, or a process where it could be proven that the travel could be conducted safely. And neither of those issues, those details, were provided in that report, which I accept from the investigators. That report, I think, was authored prior to the instruction being delivered from the Commissioner's office. I think it was authored on the 10th of March, and the instruction was first distributed on the 11th. But it went through the chain of command, reaching me on the 13th with insufficient detail on it to overcome those imposts imposed by the Commissioner's executive team for approval of interstate travel at that time.
Mr. Hudson, why did you not ask for further information, or why was there no process asking for further information to justify the travel, knowing, as we do now, that police determined alternate methods for taking the statement would not be supported by them? Why did you not ask for further information, and why was there no process to have further information?
I actually think I spoke to the Commander of State Crime before I signed that file. So the comment on the file is in addition to the conversation we had about excluding other alternative means of obtaining that same evidence, and also providing evidence as to how the travel could be conducted safely under work health and safety requirements, which was the Commissioner's executive team determination, of which I'm obviously a member, prior to it being appropriately considered. And I wish that statement, I wanted that statement to be taken, Mr. Chair.
My time has expired. Mr. Hudson, my time has expired. Could you provide on notice detail of that conversation you had with State Crime Command?
Yes, sure. Certainly.
Okay, thanks very much. We've come to an end today's examination. I note that a number of questions have been taken on notice, and the Secretary will be in touch with you soon regarding those questions and the supplementary questions we have for you. So thanks very much for coming along, and that's the end of today. Could members of the committee please stay on for a deliberative?